My heart nearly stopped when I opened our mortgage statement. The loan balance had doubled overnight. A second mortgage I never signed for. That night, while searching Richard's office, I discovered photos of him with another woman, text messages about their dream home, purchased with our equity, and something else. Evidence of his corporate fraud that would become my unexpected salvation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood before 30 eager high school seniors teaching financial literacy that Tuesday morning in late September. Always review your financial statements, I advised them as I clicked to the next slide in my PowerPoint presentation. You'd be surprised what you might discover. If only I had followed my own advice sooner. I'd been ignoring our bank statements for months, trusting that Richard, my husband of 15 years and CFO of Westridge Pharmaceuticals, had everything under control. You focus on shaping young minds, he'd say with that reassuring smile that had first attracted me to him at my cousin's wedding. I'll handle the finances. That afternoon, as my students filed out after the final bell, my phone lit up with a text from Richard. Working late again. Don't wait up. The third time this week, and it was only Tuesday. I sighed, gathering my papers. His late nights had become more frequent over the past 6 months, coinciding with the promotion he'd received after nearly a decade with the company. Another solo dinner, Emma? Darlene, the English teacher from across the hall, poked her head into my classroom. Richard's caught up at work again, I explained, trying to keep the resignation from my voice. Girl, you need some you time then. Join us for happy hour at Malone's. Half-price appetizers and good company. I hesitated. Richard and I had unspoken routines. Even when he worked late, I was expected to be home, preparing for the next day, maintaining our immaculate colonial in Oak Ridge Estates. But something about the growing stack of late nights and missed dinners steeled my resolve. You know what? I'd love to. 3 hours later, I returned home feeling lighter than I had in months. The house was still empty. Richard's working. Late apparently extending well into the evening. I kicked off my shoes and noticed the mail I'd neglected since returning from my 3-day teaching conference in Denver. Among the catalogs and bills sat an official-looking envelope from Riverside Federal Credit Union. Probably just our mortgage statement, I thought, setting it aside for Richard. He always handled those. But something stopped me. Perhaps the financial literacy lesson still fresh in my mind, or maybe the 2 glasses of Chardonnay at happy hour giving me a boost of independence. Whatever the reason, I picked up the envelope and tore it open. The statement inside made no sense at first glance. Our monthly payment had nearly doubled from $1,800 to $3,450. The loan balance, which should have been around $230,000 on our original mortgage, now read $475,000. I blinked, assuming I'd misread, but the numbers didn't change. At the top of the statement was a reference to a second mortgage with a principal of $245,000, originated 3 months ago. My hands trembled as I read the details. The second mortgage had been authorized by both Richard Madigan and Emma Madigan, except I had signed no such documents. My supposed signature was there on the statement acknowledgement, but it wasn't mine. I called the credit union immediately, but at 8:15 p.m. I only reached their automated system promising a return call the next business day. Next, I tried Richard, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Hey, it's me, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. There's something weird with the mortgage statement. Call me as soon as you can. While waiting for his call, I paced our kitchen, mind racing. $250,000. Where had it gone? Our joint checking account showed no unusual deposits. We hadn't done any renovations or made any major purchases that I knew of. Richard's sleek Tesla pulled into the garage just after 10 p.m. I sat at the kitchen island, the mortgage statement laid out before me, a cup of tea gone cold at my elbow. He entered through the mudroom, loosening his tie, surprise registering on his face when he saw me. "You're still up," he said, setting his briefcase down. Then his eyes fell on the statement. Ah. Just, ah. Not confusion, not concern. Just acknowledgement. "Richard, what is this?" I asked, pointing to the paper. "It says we took out a second mortgage, but I never signed anything." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now seemed calculated. "I was going to tell you. It's for an investment opportunity. Very promising returns." "An investment?" My voice rose. "You forged my signature for an investment?" "I didn't forge anything," he said sharply. "You authorized me to handle the finances years ago. I've signed your name on dozens of documents. On utility bills, Richard, not on a mortgage for our home." My hand slammed down on the counter. "Where is the money? It's not in our checking account." "It's tied up in the investment," he said, his tone measured, reasonable. The same tone he used when explaining to me why we couldn't afford the summer in Europe I'd wanted last year. "It's completely safe, Emma. I know what I'm doing." "What investment? Which company? I want details." He checked his watch. "It's late. We both have early mornings. Let's discuss this tomorrow when we're fresh." "No, we'll discuss it now." Richard's jaw tightened, a warning sign I'd learned to recognize over the years. "I've made us a lot of money with my financial decisions. Have a little faith." Faith. The word hung between us. 15 years of marriage, and he was asking for faith after secretly borrowing against our home. "Show me," I demanded. "Show me the investment documents." "They're at the office." Too quick, too smooth. "I'll bring them home tomorrow." "Your briefcase," I said, nodding toward where he'd set it down. "You always bring work home. Are the documents in there?" His hand moved protectively toward the leather briefcase. "No." I lunged for it, surprising us both with my speed. Clutching it to my chest, I backed away as he advanced. "You're being ridiculous," he said, his voice controlled, but his eyes flashing warning. "Give me my briefcase, Emma." "If there's nothing to hide, let me see inside." "It's confidential company information. You know that." We stood at an impasse in our chef's kitchen with its marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, all symbols of the successful life we'd built together, a life now revealing hairline fractures. "If you don't show me what's in this briefcase," I said steadily, "I'm calling the police to report fraud." His laugh was sharp. "And tell them what? That your husband, an authorized signer on all our accounts, made a financial decision? They'll tell you it's a civil matter." He was right, and we both knew it. But something in me wouldn't back down. Not this time. "Then I'll call Patricia," I said, naming his boss, the CEO of Westridge. "I'll ask her about the company's policy on executives forging signatures." Richard's confident facade slipped for just a moment. "You wouldn't. Try me." With deliberate slowness, he reached for the briefcase, took it from my grasp, and set it on the counter. His fingers worked the combination lock, and he flipped it open. Inside were the usual folders and his company laptop. Nothing suspicious at first glance. Then he reached for the laptop, hesitated, and instead pulled out a folder labeled Sunnybrook Properties. "Fine. Since you insist on knowing, everything immediately." He practically threw the folder at me. "It's a real estate development. Luxury condos breaking ground next spring. The return will be substantial." I opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Investment prospectus, projected returns, partnership agreements. It looked legitimate at first glance, but something felt off. The developer was listed as Sunnybrook LLC, with a managing partner named Vanessa Hargrove. The name triggered a distant memory. Vanessa? Wasn't she your former assistant? The one who left last year? A muscle twitched in Richard's jaw. She's established herself in real estate development. She has excellent connections. I continued flipping through the paperwork until I found what I was looking for: the address of the property. 1857 Lakeview Drive. Where exactly is this development happening? The far side of the lake. It's an up-and-coming area. I pulled out my phone and searched the address. What came up wasn't a vacant lot ready for luxury condos, but a single-family home, recently purchased, according to Zillow, for exactly $245,000. Interesting investment strategy, I said, turning my phone to show him the listing, complete with photos of a charming lakefront cottage. One house, already built, purchased 3 months ago. Richard's eyes hardened, but before he could respond, his phone chimed with a text. He glanced down automatically, and I saw it on his face, a flicker of something that made my stomach drop. I grabbed his phone. "Emma." He reached for it, but I stepped back, rapidly tapping to open the message. The text was from VH and read simply, "Missing you tonight. The sunset over the lake was beautiful from our bedroom. When can you come home again?" Our eyes met across the kitchen island. 15 years of marriage distilled into one moment of terrible clarity. "Richard," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "what have you done?" That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? The bed felt enormous with Richard banished to the guest room. My decision, not his. He'd tried to explain, to rationalize, to minimize what he'd done. The investment story crumbled almost immediately when faced with the evidence on his phone. "It's not what you think," he'd insisted. But the photos I found told a different story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As he slept down the hall, I sat cross-legged on our bed, surrounded by evidence of a life I thought I knew. Bank statements from the past 6 months, credit card bills, property tax assessments, insurance documents, all the financial papers. I'd willingly handed over to Richard, trusting him implicitly while I focused on my career educating young minds. The more I examined our financial history, the more I saw what I'd been blind to for months, perhaps years. The first light of dawn filtered through our bedroom curtains when I finally understood the full scope of Richard's betrayal. It wasn't just the second mortgage or even the affair with Vanessa. It was the systematic deception that had been right before my eyes all along. If only I'd looked. Before confronting Richard again, I needed more evidence, more answers. I took a shower, dressed in my most professional outfit, a navy pencil skirt and white blouse that I usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences, and headed to school 2 hours earlier than usual. In the quiet of my empty classroom, I made 3 phone calls. First to Riverside Federal Credit Union to request all documentation related to the second mortgage, then to our homeowner's insurance company to check for any policy changes, and, finally, to my cousin Natalie, who happened to be a divorce attorney in the next county. "He did what?" Natalie's voice rose in disbelief when I explained the situation. "Emma, that's fraud. Plain and simple." "I know," I said, watching the school parking lot slowly fill with arriving teachers through my classroom window. "But there's more to this, Nat. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I make any moves." "Document everything," she advised, "and don't confront him again until you have the full picture. Men like Richard, they're good at spinning stories, at making you doubt yourself." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and created a secure folder titled ELHS Curriculum 2025. Innocent enough if Richard happened to see it, but containing notes on everything I'd discovered so far. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick. Patricia Moore, the principal, was understanding. "You haven't taken a sick day in 3 years, Emma. Take care of yourself. We'll manage." Instead of resting, I drove to the county records office. If Richard had been moving money around or property, there would be public records. I spent 2 hours searching databases, requesting documents, and making copies. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, must have sensed my distress. "Looking up property records for a school project?" she asked, helping me navigate the system. "Something like that," I mumbled, not meeting her eyes. She glanced at the name I was searching. "You know, there's a faster way to find recent transactions." Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up a screen I hadn't seen. "Here. All property transactions involving Richard Madigan in the past 5 years." The screen showed 3 entries. Our home purchase from 8 years ago, a small commercial property Richard had told me was for his investment group 2 years ago, and there it was. 1857 Lakeview Drive, purchased 3 months ago by Sunnybrook LLC. "Can I see who owns Sunnybrook LLC?" I asked. The clerk typed again. "Registered 3 months and 2 days ago. Single member LLC. Owner." She squinted at the screen. "Vanessa Hargrove." My stomach twisted. "And the commercial property. From 2 years ago. Who owns that?" More typing. "That would be Ridgemont Partners LLC." She looked up. "Want me to check who owns that too?" I nodded, already suspecting what I'd find. "Ridgemont Partners. Registered to Richard Madigan and Vanessa Hargrove. Joint ownership. 2 years. The betrayal went back at least 2 years." "Is there any way to see the purchase funds?" asked, voice hollow. "That wouldn't be in our records, honey. You'd need bank statements for that." "Bank statements, of course." I thanked the clerk and left, my manila folder now thick with documents. Next stop, our bank. Riverside Federal Credit Union was located in a modern glass building downtown. I'd been there perhaps twice in the 15 years we'd had accounts there. Richard always handled the banking. I approached the reception desk, where a young man with a neat beard and name tag reading Noah greeted me. "I'd like to speak with someone about our mortgage accounts," I said, "and I'll need copies of all statements for the past year." "Certainly. May I have your name and account number?" "Emma Madigan." I provided our account number from the statement I'd brought. "I'm listed as a joint account holder on everything." Noah tapped at his computer. "Yes, Mrs. Madigan, it looks like your husband was in just last week. Is there a specific concern with the accounts?" "Last week? What had Richard been doing here?" "Yes, there are several concerns. That's why I need to speak with someone." Noah directed me to a small office where Diane Lawson, a loan officer, greeted me. Her handshake was firm, her expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Madigan, how can I help you today?" I placed the mortgage statement on her desk. "I need to understand how this second mortgage was approved. I never signed any paperwork for it." Diane's eyes flicked to the document, then back to me. "Let me pull up the file." She typed quickly, then frowned slightly. "According to our records, both you and your husband signed the application and closing documents. I can print copies for you if you'd like to review them." "Please." While she was gone, I looked around her office. Family photos on the desk. Diane with a man and 2 teenage boys, all smiling on a beach. A degree from State University on the wall. A small plaque for Loan Officer of the Year, 2023. A normal life. A life where people didn't discover their spouses had mortgaged their homes for their mistresses. Diane returned with a thick stack of papers. "Here's everything: the application, income verification, appraisal, and closing documents." I flipped to the signature pages. There it was, Emma Madigan, written in what appeared to be my handwriting. Except it wasn't. The E was too loopy, the crossing of the M's too high. A decent forgery, but definitely not my signature. "This isn't my signature," I said, looking up at Diane. "I never signed these documents." Diane's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Mrs. Madigan, are you saying someone forged your signature? My husband did. I never knew about this mortgage until I opened the statement yesterday. She took a slow breath. That's a very serious accusation. I know, and I can prove it. I pulled out my driver's license and a recent check I'd written for my niece's graduation. This is my actual signature. You can see it doesn't match what's on your documents. Diane compared them carefully. There are differences, she acknowledged. But Mrs. Madigan, your husband is the CFO of Westridge Pharmaceuticals. He's been a client here for years. This is highly unusual. I'm aware of how unusual it is to discover your husband has committed fraud, I said evenly. I'd like copies of all our bank statements for the past 2 years, please. And I want a fraud alert placed on all our accounts immediately. Nothing to be approved without my in-person signature verification. Diane's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. I'll need to involve our security department. This may take some time. I have time. 3 hours later, I left the credit union with a USB drive containing all our financial records and a promise from their fraud department to investigate the forged signatures. They'd also frozen all our accounts pending resolution, something Richard would discover the moment he tried to use his credit card. I should have felt victorious. Instead, as I sat in my car in the parking lot, I felt hollow. 15 years of marriage, and I'd never truly known the man I'd shared my life with. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Where are you? School said you called in sick. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to the address I'd found in the county records, 1857 Lakeview Drive. The lake house was everything I'd never known I wanted. Single story with large windows overlooking the water, a wraparound porch, garden beds bursting with late summer flowers. It was charming, intimate. Nothing like our showpiece colonial in Oak Ridge Estates with its formal living room we rarely used and dining room set that had cost more than my first car. I parked across the street, watching the house. No cars in the driveway. Was Vanessa at work? Did she have a job other than seducing my husband and stealing my home equity? As I sat there, a silver BMW pulled into the driveway. My breath caught. It wasn't Richard's Tesla, but I recognized the car. It belonged to Thomas Blackwell, Richard's deputy at Westridge Pharmaceuticals. What was Thomas doing at Vanessa's lake house? I slouched down in my seat as Thomas exited his car, straightened his tie, and approached the front door. He knocked, waited, then used a key to let himself in. Curiouser and curiouser. I waited 15 minutes, debating my next move. Should I confront them? Take photos as evidence? Drive away and pretend I'd never seen Thomas entering the love nest my husband had purchased for his mistress? The decision was made for me when my phone rang. The screen displayed Riverside FCU. Mrs. Madigan, Diane's voice was tight. We've reviewed the account activities more thoroughly. There's something you should know. Can you come back to the branch? I'm about 30 minutes away. Can you tell me over the phone? She hesitated. It's about the wire transfers from your home equity line. They didn't all go to Sunnybrook LLC. Some went to offshore accounts. My grip tightened on the phone. How much? An additional $175,000 beyond the property purchase. I closed my eyes, processing this new betrayal. I'll be right there. As I started my car, the front door of the lake house opened. Thomas emerged, followed by a woman, but it wasn't Vanessa Hargrove. This woman was older, with silver-streaked black hair and elegant posture. She kissed Thomas on the cheek before he departed, then returned inside. Who was she? And what was her connection to the tangled web of lies Richard had spun? Back at Riverside Federal, Diane ushered me directly into a conference room where an older man in a crisp suit waited. He introduced himself as Howard Bennett, the credit union's security director. Mrs. Madigan, I apologize for the situation you find yourself in, he began. We take fraud very seriously, especially when it involves one of our premier clients. Premier clients who commit mortgage fraud are still committing crimes, I pointed out. Howard nodded grimly. Indeed, we've confirmed the signature discrepancies on the mortgage documents, but there's more. He opened a folder. The funds from your equity line were distributed in an unusual pattern. $245,000 went to Sunnybrook LLC for the lake property purchase, as you discovered. But an additional $175,000 was wired in 3 separate transactions to an account in Grand Cayman. Richard has an offshore account? Not precisely. Howard slid a document across the table. The account is registered to Ridgemont Partners, LLC. But here's what's concerning. Similar wire transfers have been made from several other equity lines and commercial loans approved by our institution over the past 18 months. All to the same Cayman account. My mind raced to keep up. Are you saying Richard has been doing this with other people's loans? Other people's homes? We're still investigating. But yes, it appears Mr. Madigan may have been involved in a larger pattern of fraudulent activities. The timing coincides with his position on our loan approval committee. I stared at him. Richard serves on your loan committee? He never mentioned that. He joined as an advisor 18 months ago. His position at Westridge gave him considerable authority in our community. Many loans were expedited based on his recommendations. I thought of the commercial property from 2 years ago, Ridgemont Partners LLC, jointly owned by Richard and Vanessa. The puzzle pieces were shifting, forming a new picture. This isn't just about an affair, is it? I asked slowly. This is about money laundering. Howard's expression remained carefully neutral. We can't make that determination yet, but we have contacted the appropriate regulatory authorities. Mrs. Madigan, I must ask, did you have any knowledge of these activities? None, I said firmly. Until yesterday, I trusted my husband completely with our finances. Howard studied me, then nodded. We believe you, and will need your cooperation as this investigation proceeds. You'll have it, but I need something from you too. I leaned forward. I need to know exactly what Richard has been doing. All of it. Because I suspect my husband's betrayal goes far beyond our marriage. As I drove home that afternoon, my mind whirled with all I'd learned. Richard's betrayal was more elaborate and far-reaching than I'd initially imagined. This wasn't just about Vanessa or the lake house. Those were merely symptoms of a deeper corruption, one that had potentially implicated one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the region and a respected financial institution. The woman at the lake house remained a mystery. Not Vanessa, but clearly connected somehow. And Thomas Blackwell's involvement suggested the web extended into Westridge's executive ranks. I pulled into our driveway, noticing Richard's Tesla was already there. Earlier than usual, no doubt. He'd discovered the frozen accounts. As I sat in my car gathering courage, a notification popped up on my phone. An email from Natalie with the subject line, "Open immediately." I clicked it open to find a single sentence. Don't confront him yet. Call me first. Too late. The front door opened and Richard strode out, face thunderous. What the hell did you do? He demanded, yanking open my car door before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt. The bank called. All our accounts are frozen. I looked up at the man I'd loved for 15 years, really looked at him. The carefully cultivated appearance of success, designer suit, expensive watch, perfect haircut. The controlled anger that always made me back down in arguments. The practiced charm that had blinded me to the red flags for so long. But now I saw something else. Fear. Richard Madigan was afraid. And suddenly, I wasn't. We need to talk, I said calmly, gathering my files and stepping out of the car. About Vanessa, about the lake house, about the money in Grand Cayman, and about why Thomas Blackwell has a key to 1857 Lakeview Drive. The color drained from Richard's face, For the first time in our marriage, I had information he didn't know. I possessed. For the first time, I had the upper hand, and I intended to use it. Richard's composure, that carefully maintained facade of the successful executive, crumbled before my eyes. His hand, still gripping my car door, trembled slightly. "You've been busy," he said, voice low as he glanced toward our neighbors. "House, let's continue this conversation inside." I clutched my folder of documents to my chest like armor as I followed him through our front door. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like an elaborate stage set. Beautiful, but ultimately fake, just like our marriage. In the kitchen, Richard poured himself 2 fingers of the expensive scotch he reserved for celebrations and business victories. He didn't offer me any. "Emma," he began, his tone shifting to the smooth, reasonable voice he used to persuade board members and investors. "I know how this looks, but there's a logical explanation for everything." "I'm listening," I said, settling at the island counter. Documents spread before me like cards in a high-stakes game. "The lake house is an investment property," he started, the lie flowing effortlessly. "Vanessa has excellent real estate connections, as I mentioned. We're planning to renovate and flip it for a substantial profit. Your name isn't on the paperwork because of potential liability issues with the renovations." I slid the bank's wire transfer records toward him. "And the $175,000 sent to Grand Cayman? Is that for imported marble countertops?" His eyes narrowed. "You've been speaking with the bank and the county records office, and soon, I suspect, federal investigators." Richard's knuckles whitened around his glass. "You have no idea what you're meddling in." "Then, enlighten me." He drained his scotch and set the glass down with deliberate control. "This is bigger than you understand, Emma. Bigger than us. I've built relationships, made commitments that can't simply be undone because you're feeling insecure about our marriage." "Insecure?" I almost laughed. "Richard, you stole equity from our home, forged my signature, and bought a lake house where you're conducting." "What, exactly?" "Because I saw Thomas Blackwell there today, meeting with a woman who wasn't Vanessa." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "You followed me?" "I investigated my husband's fraud. There's a difference." Richard began pacing, running calculations behind his eyes. I'd seen this expression countless times when he was solving complex problems at work. Now, he was determining how much to reveal, how much to conceal, and what angle would best manipulate me into compliance. "Westridge Pharmaceuticals is going through a delicate phase," he finally said. "We're preparing for an acquisition that would triple our market value." "What does that have to do with forging my signature for a second mortgage?" "The acquisition requires certain financial arrangements that need to remain confidential. Off the books. The regulators wouldn't understand the necessity." I felt a chill. "Are you talking about bribes?" "Strategic investments," he corrected sharply. "The pharmaceutical industry operates in gray areas sometimes. For the greater good." "The greater good of your bank account, you mean? And Vanessa's role in all this?" His jaw tightened. "She facilitates certain transactions. Her background in international finance has been invaluable." "Is that what you call sleeping with your former assistant while buying her a lake house with stolen money? Facilitation?" Richard slammed his hand on the counter, making me jump. "Enough! You're out of your depth, Emma. You teach teenagers about credit scores and balanced checkbooks. This is global finance and corporate strategy. Things you couldn't possibly understand." His condescension ignited something inside me, a slow-burning fury that had perhaps been smoldering for years. How often had he dismissed my capabilities? How frequently had he leveraged my trust to keep me in the dark? "I understand fraud, Richard. I understand theft. And I understand that you've put everything we've built at risk, including Westridge's reputation and stock value." I pulled out my phone, Should I call Patricia right now and ask her about these strategic investments? I'm sure Westridge's CEO would be fascinated to learn how her CFO is spending company resources. Richard's expression shifted from anger to calculation. Patricia is aware of certain aspects of our financial strategy. Is she aware that you're funneling money through my home equity to offshore accounts? Or that you and Thomas are meeting mysterious women at a lake house purchased with fraudulent loans? For a moment, I thought I'd pushed too far. Richard's face flushed with a rage I'd rarely witnessed. He took one step toward me, fists clenched at his sides. I stood my ground, heart hammering against my ribs. Careful, Richard. Assault charges. Wouldn't look good on top of the fraud investigation. He froze, then slowly unclenched his fists. This isn't just about us anymore, Emma. There are powerful people involved, people who don't appreciate complications. Am I a complication? Now? Your wife of 15 years? You're becoming one. His tone had turned icy. I've protected you by keeping you uninvolved. Now you're forcing my hand. Protected me? By stealing from me? By keeping you ignorant? By making sure your name wasn't connected to any of this? He ran a hand through his hair, disheveling his perfect appearance. Do you think I wanted to use our home equity? There were other options, but they would have required your direct involvement. I was trying to shield you. His twisted logic was almost impressive. In Richard's mind, his betrayal was a form of protection, a noble sacrifice. I don't need your protection, I said quietly. I need the truth, all of it. Richard checked his watch, an unconscious tell he had whenever weighing options. I have a meeting I can't miss. We'll continue this discussion later. With Vanessa? Or Thomas? Or the mystery woman at the lake house? His eyes snapped to mine. What exactly did you see at the lake house? Enough to know whatever you're involved in goes beyond an affair. Richard reached for his keys. Stay home tonight, Emma. Don't call anyone. Don't discuss this with anyone, for your own safety. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. His voice softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the man I thought I'd married. There are aspects of this situation you don't understand yet. People who would be concerned to learn how much you know. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of business are you really involved in, Richard? Instead of answering, he walked to the "Or I'll be late, don't wait up." After he left, I stood motionless in our kitchen, trying to process the conversation. Richard hadn't denied the affair with Vanessa, the fraudulent mortgage, or the offshore accounts. Instead, he'd implied something far more disturbing, that his activities had connections to people who might consider me a threat. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Natalie. Did you talk to him? Call me ASAP. I was about to call when I noticed a folder on the counter that hadn't been there before. Richard must have brought it in from his car. The label read, Westridge Acquisition, Confidential. I shouldn't look, I thought. Then I remembered the forged signature on our mortgage documents, the lake house, the offshore accounts, and Richard's veiled threats. Whatever moral qualms I might have had about invading his privacy had been obliterated by his betrayal. I opened the folder. Inside were financial projections for a merger between Westridge Pharmaceuticals and Novatech Biologics, a European company I vaguely recognized from headlines about breakthrough cancer treatments. The documents detailed an acquisition price, nearly double Novatech's current market value, along with unusual compensation structures for key executives, including an 8-figure transition package for Richard. Paper-clipped to these projections was a smaller document, an independent laboratory analysis of Novatech's flagship drug, NV237. I skimmed the technical jargon until a highlighted section caught my eye. Phase 3 trial data appears to have been selectively reported. Full analysis indicates efficacy rates of 23%, rather than the publicly claimed 68%. side effect profile significantly worse than disclosed. My blood ran cold. Westridge was preparing to acquire a company whose breakthrough drug didn't work as claimed, and Richard was orchestrating the financial arrangements. This wasn't just about an affair or financial fraud. It was about a potentially criminal pharmaceutical merger that could harm countless patients and defraud shareholders. I quickly photographed every document with my phone, then returned the folder exactly as I'd found it. My hands trembled as I called Natalie. "Emma, thank God," she answered immediately. "I've been trying to reach you. You need to be careful." "Why? What have you found out?" "I pulled some strings with a friend at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Richard's name has come up in an ongoing investigation. Something big involving Westridge and overseas accounts. I just found documents about a merger with Novatech Biologics. It looks like the company's main drug doesn't work, but they're hiding that fact. Westridge is planning to acquire them, anyway." Natalie was silent for a moment. "Emma, this is serious. Securities fraud, wire fraud, potentially endangering patients. You need to protect yourself." "How?" "Richard knows I've been to the bank and the county records office. He knows I saw Thomas at the lake house." "You need leverage," Natalie said firmly. "And you need to be somewhere safe tonight. Come to my place." "I can't just leave. Richard said—" "I don't give a damn what Richard said," Natalie interrupted. "He's trying to intimidate you into silence. Classic abuser tactic." The word abuser hit me hard. I'd never thought of Richard that way, but the financial control, the gaslighting, the veiled threats, they painted a disturbing picture. "Okay," I agreed. "I'll pack a bag." "Don't take your car," Natalie advised. "They might be tracking it. Call an Uber to a shopping center, then call a different service to my place. And Emma, don't tell anyone where you're going." As I hung up, a text message appeared from an unknown number. "Enjoying your investigation, Mrs. Madigan? Curiosity can be dangerous. Ask your husband." My heart pounded as I stared at the message. There was no precedent for how to respond when strangers sent threatening texts after discovering your husband's criminal activities. I took a screenshot, then deleted the message. Whoever had sent it wanted me to know I was being watched. The question was, by whom? Richard, Vanessa, Thomas, the mystery woman at the lake house, or someone even further up the chain in whatever conspiracy I'd stumbled into. One thing was certain. I no longer felt safe in my own home. I packed essentials into a small overnight bag, ordered an Uber as Natalie suggested, and left without setting the alarm system. Let Richard wonder where I'd gone when he returned from his meeting. As the car pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at the house I'd loved for 8 years. The place where I'd graded papers at the kitchen island, planned lessons in the sunny office, hosted dinner parties for colleagues in the formal dining room. The home where I'd believed I was building a life with a man who loved me. Now it felt like a beautiful prison I was finally escaping. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Running won't help. We know about Natalie." I froze in the backseat of the Uber. How could they know where I was going? I hadn't even mentioned it on the phone call. Natalie had simply said, "my place." Unless... "Change of plans," I told the Uber driver, heart pounding. "Please take me to the Hampton Inn downtown instead." The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Everything okay, ma'am?" No. Everything was decidedly not okay. Someone was monitoring my communications and knew I planned to go to Natalie's. My husband was involved in pharmaceutical fraud and possibly worse. And I was fleeing my home with little more than a change of clothes and my teaching materials. "Just a last-minute change," I said, forcing a smile. I texted Natalie using WhatsApp, hoping it might be more secure. "Can't come to your place. Being watched. Will call when safe." At the Hampton Inn, I paid cash for a room, something I'd never done before. The clerk looked mildly surprised, but didn't comment. Once inside the anonymous beige room, I placed the desk chair under the doorknob, drawn by some half-remembered scene from a thriller movie. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, I emptied my bag and took inventory of what I had. My laptop, phone, the USB drive from the bank, photos of Richard's merger documents, my wallet, 2 changes of clothes, basic toiletries, and, absurdly, the stack of sophomore essays on The Great Gatsby I'd planned to grade that evening. The normalcy of those essays, with their earnest attempts to analyze the American dream, felt like artifacts from another woman's life. A woman who taught literature and financial literacy, who believed her husband was working late to support their comfortable lifestyle. A woman who didn't know about offshore accounts, forged signatures, and pharmaceutical fraud. I opened my laptop and created a new secure email account, then sent everything I had, bank records, county documents, photos of the merger papers, to this new address and to Natalie. Evidence secured in multiple locations. My phone rang. Richard. I declined the call. It immediately rang again. This time, Darlene from school. I hesitated, then answered. Emma? Thank God. Are you okay? Darlene's voice was tense with concern. I'm fine, I said cautiously. Why? There's a man here at school looking for you. Says he's your husband's colleague, Thomas something. He seemed really insistent on finding you. Said it was an emergency. My blood ran cold. Thomas Blackwell was searching for me at my workplace. What did you tell him? That you called in sick, of course. But Emma, he was. Intense. Asked about your schedule, your friends, if you mentioned going anywhere. I got a bad feeling. Trust that feeling, I said. If he comes back, don't tell him anything. And Darlene? Be careful. These people aren't who they seem. After hanging up, I paced the small hotel room. Thomas was looking for me. Had Richard sent him? Or was he acting independently? And how had the unknown texter known about Natalie? My phone had to be compromised. Richard had set it up years ago, insisting on installing security software for my protection. I'd thought nothing of it then, just another example of his taking care of technical matters while I focused on my teaching career. I turned the ESI, phone off, removed the battery, and placed it in the bathroom sink. Then I used the hotel phone to call Natalie from memory. It's me, I said when she answered. I think my phone is compromised. Thomas Blackwell was looking for me at school. Thank God you didn't come here, Natalie said. Emma, I've been researching. This goes deeper than we thought. Westridge isn't just acquiring Novatech. They're using it to offload development costs for a failed drug while inflating the stock price before a larger merger. With whom? Farm Corp International. It's a 3-way deal worth billions. The SEC has been investigating Farm Corp for months. Your evidence about the efficacy data could blow the whole thing open. What should I do? I have a friend at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We need to get you and your evidence there. But not tonight. It's too risky with Thomas looking for you. Stay where you are. I'll come to you tomorrow morning. After giving her the hotel information, I hung up and tried to think. There had to be something I was missing. Some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of it all. The woman at the lake house. Who was she? And why was she meeting with Thomas? I opened my laptop again and searched for Vanessa Hargrove Westridge Pharmaceuticals. Nothing relevant appeared. I tried Vanessa Hargrove Novatech and again found nothing. On to I. A hunch, I searched Thomas Blackwell Novatech and struck gold. A press release from 3 years ago mentioned Thomas as part of a delegation that visited Novatech's research facility in Switzerland. And there in the accompanying photo stood Thomas beside Novatech's chief scientific officer, Dr. Eleanor Hargrove. Hargrove, the same last name as Vanessa. Further searching revealed Dr. Eleanor Hargrove was a respected researcher with dozens of publications on oncology treatments. Her biography on Novatech's website mentioned she had previously worked at the FDA, specifically in the Drug Approval Division. The pieces clicked together. Vanessa wasn't just Richard's mistress. She was somehow connected to Dr. Hargrove, possibly her daughter, given the age difference I'd observed. The lake house wasn't just a love nest. It was a meeting place away from corporate eyes and ears. But what were they planning? The falsified efficacy data suggested something deeply unethical, possibly criminal. Was Dr. Hargrove involved in manipulating the trial results? Or was she somehow being used by Thomas and Richard? I searched for Dr. Eleanor Hargrove FDA scandal and found a small article from 7 years ago. Dr. Hargrove had resigned from the FDA following allegations she had fast-tracked approval for a medication with questionable trial data. The case had been settled out of court, with no admission of wrongdoing. The story was taking shape. Novatech's breakthrough drug didn't work as claimed. Dr. Hargrove, with her FDA connections and history, was potentially helping them navigate approval despite the poor results. Westridge, specifically Richard and Thomas, were orchestrating the acquisition while hiding the problematic data from shareholders and the board. And somehow, Vanessa served as the go-between, with properties purchased through shell companies using fraudulently obtained funds. A sophisticated scheme, executed by people who believed themselves too clever to be caught. And I, the high school teacher who wasn't supposed to understand global finance and corporate strategy, had stumbled upon the whole operation because my husband hadn't expected me to read our mortgage statement. There was a certain poetic justice to it, but justice wouldn't keep me safe tonight. I double-checked the chair under the doorknob and tried to sleep, my dreams filled with Richard's cold eyes and Thomas Blackwell searching for me through endless school corridors. I woke early, startled by housekeeping knocking despite the "do not disturb" sign. When I called out that I didn't need service, a man's voice responded, "Sorry, wrong room." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice had sounded familiar. I peered through the peephole but saw only an empty hallway. Still, unease gnawed at me. That voice. My watch showed 6:45 a.m. Natalie wouldn't arrive until 8 a.m. I was trapped in this room for another hour, and I no longer felt safe. I dressed quickly, gathering my few belongings. There had to be another exit besides the main lobby, a service elevator or stairs. The hotel floor plan on the back of the door showed a stairwell at the opposite end of the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for movement. Hearing nothing, I removed the chair, took a deep breath, and opened the door just enough to peek out. The hallway appeared empty. I slipped out and walked quickly toward the stairwell, trying to project the confidence of a business traveler, heading out for an early meeting. I had almost reached the stairwell when the elevator dinged. I froze as the doors slid open, revealing Thomas Blackwell and a hotel security officer. "That's her," Thomas said, pointing. "My colleague's wife. She's having a mental health episode. We've been so worried." The security officer looked at me with concern. "Ma'am, your family's been looking for you. Your husband is very concerned." "My husband forged my signature on a fraudulent mortgage and is involved in pharmaceutical securities fraud," I said clearly. "This man is his accomplice. I'm leaving, and if you try to stop me, I'll scream and call the police." Thomas's professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of anger. "Emma, you're confused. Richard explained everything. The mortgage was a misunderstanding. We just want to help you. Then you won't mind if I leave." The security officer looked uncertain, glancing between us. "Ma'am, perhaps we should call your husband." "No," I said firmly. "I'm an adult woman checking out of a hotel. That's not a crime." I edged toward the stairwell door, maintaining eye contact with the security officer. "This man is not my family. He has no legal right to detain me. If he tries, that's false imprisonment." My years of explaining complex concepts to teenagers were paying off. My voice remained clear and authoritative despite my racing heart. "Let's all calm down. the security officer said, raising his hands. "Ma'am, you're free to leave." "Sir, unless you have legal documentation showing guardianship, I can't prevent her from going." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Fine. But Emma, Richard is devastated. Whatever you think you know, I know enough." I cut him off, backing through the stairwell door. "Tell Richard I'll be speaking with the FBI Financial Crimes Division today. He can explain himself to them." I ran down the stairs, adrenaline carrying me from the 4th floor to the lobby in seconds. I burst out the side entrance, disoriented momentarily by the bright morning sunshine. Where to go? Thomas would surely follow. Natalie wasn't due for another hour. Across the street stood the public library, just opening for the day. Perfect. A public place with security cameras and witnesses. I hurried across, checking over my shoulder to see Thomas emerging from the hotel, scanning the street. Inside the library, I found a computer station with a clear view of the entrance and logged in with my teacher's library card. Thomas wouldn't expect me to stay so close, but I needed internet access to complete my investigation. If I was going to the FBI, I wanted to arrive with a complete picture of what I was dealing with. My amateur sleuthing had uncovered pieces of the puzzle. Now I needed to assemble them into a compelling case. I searched for FarmCorp International's SEC filings, focusing on merger and acquisition disclosures. Their most recent quarterly report mentioned ongoing discussions with several mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturers with complementary product pipelines. No specific mention of Westridge or Novatech, but the timing aligned with Richard's documents. Next, I searched for property records associated with Ridgemont Partners LLC. Besides the commercial property I already knew about, they owned 2 additional properties: a condominium in a luxury downtown building and a warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. I noted the addresses, then searched for Vanessa Hargrove's professional background. Her LinkedIn profile listed previous employment at both the FDA and Novatech before her role as Richard's executive assistant at Westridge. The connection to Dr. Hargrove, presumably her mother, wasn't mentioned. The missing piece clicked into place. Vanessa had worked at both organizations involved in the merger. She had insider knowledge of both Novatech's drug development issues and Westridge's acquisition plans. And with her mother's FDA connections, they had a pathway to potential approval, despite the efficacy problems. I was so engrossed in my research that I almost missed Thomas entering the library. He scanned the main reading room, not noticing me partially hidden behind a bookshelf. I ducked lower, watching as he spoke briefly with the librarian at the information desk. My phone chimed. I'd reinstalled the battery, needing it for research despite the surveillance risk. A text from Natalie. "At hotel. Where are you?" "Library across street," I typed quickly. "Thomas here too. Be careful." As I sent the message, Thomas's head snapped in my direction. He must have heard the notification sound. Our eyes met across the library and his face hardened with determination. I grabbed my bag and moved quickly toward the rear of the library, looking for another exit. There had to be one. Fire codes required it. Thomas followed, trying to appear casual while closing the distance between us. I rounded a corner into the biography section, spotted an emergency exit, and pushed through it. An alarm blared as I emerged into a service alley behind the library. I ran toward the street, pulling out my phone to call Natalie. "I'm coming around to the back of the library," she said immediately. "Get to the corner of Maple and 5th. I sprinted down the alley, hearing the emergency door slam open behind me. Thomas was in pursuit. At the corner, a silver SUV screeched to a halt. Natalie leaned across to push open the passenger door. "Get in!" I dove into the vehicle as Thomas emerged from the alley. Natalie accelerated away before I could even close the door properly. "Are you okay?" she asked, checking the rearview mirror to ensure Thomas wasn't following. "I think so," I said, trying to catch my breath. "But they know I'm gathering evidence." Thomas tried to convince hotel security I was having a mental health episode. Classic gaslighting, Natalie muttered. We need to move fast. I've arranged for you to meet with FBI Special Agent Dominic Velez at 10 a.m. He specializes in securities fraud and pharmaceutical crimes. As we drove across town toward the federal building, I organized my evidence on my laptop, creating a timeline of events, from the discovery of the mortgage statement to the connections between Westridge, Novatech, and FarmCorp. Natalie, I said suddenly, do you think Richard was ever going to tell me about any of this? Or was I just a convenient cover? The unsuspecting teacher wife who made him seem respectable? She glanced at me, her expression softening. I don't know, Emma. Men like Richard, they compartmentalize. Maybe in his mind he was protecting you by keeping you ignorant. Or maybe you were just useful window dressing for his corporate ambitions. Either way, you deserve better. The truth stung, but there was also something liberating about facing it directly. Richard had underestimated me. He'd dismissed my intelligence, my resilience, my capacity to uncover the truth. That mistake would be his undoing. We're here, Natalie said, pulling into the federal building's visitor parking. Are you ready for this? I looked down at the evidence I'd assembled, the product of 2 days of determined investigation that had uncovered what was potentially a multi-billion-dollar fraud scheme. Yes, I said. I'm ready to take back my life. The federal building's security checkpoint felt like a boundary between my old life and whatever awaited me on the other side. I emptied my pockets, removed my laptop from my bag, and walked through. The metal detector, aware that this simple act was irrevocably committing me to a path that would destroy my marriage and possibly send my husband to prison. Mrs. Madigan? A tall man in a crisp navy suit approached as we cleared security. I'm Special Agent Dominic Velez. Thank you for coming in today. Agent Velez led us through a labyrinth of corridors to a conference room where 2 other agents waited. He introduced them as Financial Analyst Maria Suarez and Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Before we begin, Agent Velez said once we were seated, I want to be clear about something. The information your cousin shared with us suggests potentially serious violations of federal securities laws, wire fraud statutes, and FDA regulations. This isn't just about a domestic dispute or a fraudulent mortgage. I understand, I said, opening my laptop. That's why I'm here. For the next 2 hours, I walked the agents through everything I'd discovered, from the mortgage statement to the offshore accounts, the falsified drug efficacy data, and the connections between Richard, Thomas, Vanessa, and Dr. Hargrove. Agent Suarez took meticulous notes while occasionally asking clarifying questions about transactions and timelines. Agent Donovan focused on the pharmaceutical aspects, particularly interested in the documentation about NV237's actual efficacy rates. This is concerning, he said, examining the lab report photos I'd taken. If Novatech is misrepresenting clinical trial results to boost their acquisition value, that's securities fraud at minimum. If Westridge executives are complicit, the liability extends to them as well. And if the drug eventually received approval based on falsified data, Agent Velez added, we'd be looking at FDA violations that could potentially endanger patients. The gravity of the situation settled over me. This wasn't just about Richard's betrayal or even financial crimes. Real lives could be at risk if an ineffective cancer treatment reached patients based on manipulated data. There's something else, I said, pulling up the property records I'd found. The transactions between these shell companies, Ridgemont Partners and Sunnybrook LLC, involve properties that seem to be used for meetings outside corporate oversight. I believe that lake house is where they're coordinating the scheme. Agent Velez nodded thoughtfully. We'll need surveillance warrants for those locations. Mrs. Madigan, the evidence you've brought us is substantial, but we need to proceed. Carefully. These are powerful individuals at major corporations. Building a case that will withstand their legal teams requires methodical work. What happens now? I asked. Now, Agent Velez said, we need to protect you. Your husband and his associates know you've uncovered their scheme. That makes you a threat to operations worth potentially billions of dollars. The reality of my situation hit me full force. I wasn't just a wronged wife anymore. I was a witness to corporate fraud who might testify against executives with everything to lose. We'd like to place you in protective custody while we pursue this investigation, Agent Donovan said, just until we can secure the evidence and make arrests. Natalie, who had been quietly observing until now, leaned forward. Is that really necessary? She could stay with me, or... They found me at the hotel, I interrupted. They knew I was planning to go to your place. These people have resources and connections. If they're willing to commit fraud on this scale, what else might they do? To protect themselves. Agent Velez nodded grimly. We've seen cases where witnesses faced significant pressure or threats. We take those risks seriously. What about my job? I asked. My students? We can arrange for a leave of absence. Agent Suarez suggested. Medical or family emergency, something that won't raise suspicions but will explain your absence. As we discussed the logistics, Agent Donovan was called out of the room. He returned moments later, his expression tense. We have a situation, he said to Velez. Richard Madigan just called the main reception desk asking if his wife is in the building. When told they couldn't provide that information, he said he's filing a missing persons report and coming here with police. A preemptive move, Natalie said. He's trying to control the narrative, paint Emma as unstable or missing to discredit her before she can make accusations. Agent Velez stood. We need to move you to a secure location now, Mrs. Madigan. We'll handle your husband when he arrives. As they escorted me through a back exit to an unmarked sedan, my phone rang. Richard. After a nod from Agent Velez, I answered on speaker. Emma, where are you? Richard's voice was controlled but tense. I've been worried sick. First you disappear from the house. Then Thomas says he saw you acting erratically at some hotel. I'm safe, Richard, I interrupted. That's all you need to know. This is ridiculous. Whatever you think you've discovered, you're misinterpreting. Come home and I'll explain everything. Like you explained the second mortgage, or the lake house, or the offshore accounts? His tone hardened. You're making a scene over nothing. A few financial arrangements you don't understand. If you'd just... I understand enough, I said. I understand NV-237 has a 23% efficacy rate, not 68%. I understand you and Thomas are working with Dr. Hargrove to hide that fact during the FarmCorp merger. Silence stretched for several seconds. Who have you told? He finally asked, all pretense of concern evaporating. Goodbye, Richard. As Agent Suarez drove, I stared out the window at the city passing by. The school where I taught, the coffee shop where Richard and I used to meet for lunch early in our marriage, the park where we'd once discussed having children before Richard's career became all-consuming. How had I missed the signs? The gradual distancing, the increasing secrecy about finances, the late nights and unexplained absences? Perhaps I'd been complicit in my own deception, choosing to believe in the comfortable life we'd built rather than questioning its foundations. After an hour's drive, we arrived at a nondescript hotel in a neighboring city. Agent Velez explained. It was a temporary safe house until more permanent arrangements could be made. We'll have agents nearby at all times, he assured me. Don't use your phone or credit cards. Don't contact anyone without clearing it with us first. After they left, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, overwhelmed by the surreal turn my life had taken. 48 hours ago, I'd been a high school teacher grading essays. Now I was essentially in witness protection, hiding from my own husband. My burner phone, provided by the FBI, rang at 7 p.m. Mrs. Madigan, it's Agent Velez. There's been a development. Your husband came to the federal building with his attorney and Thomas Blackwell. They've filed a temporary restraining order claiming you stole confidential corporate documents and are attempting to extort them. That's absurd, I exclaimed. We know, but it's a legal maneuver to buy time and potentially discredit you. There's something else. They're trying to gain access to your financial accounts, claiming you're mentally unstable and can't manage your affairs. Can they do that? Not without a court hearing, but it shows they're pulling out all the stops. However, we've obtained warrants for the Lake House property and Ridgemont Partners commercial building. Searches are underway now. After hanging up, I paced the hotel room, my mind racing. Richard was attempting to declare me mentally incompetent, a move that would give him control over any assets in my name and potentially undermine my credibility as a witness. The ultimate betrayal from a man who had already betrayed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. At 9:30 p.m., the burner phone rang. Again. This time it was Agent Suarez. "We found something," she said without preamble. "At the lake house. I think you need to see this." I thought I wasn't supposed to leave the hotel. "Agent Velez is sending a security team. This changes everything." 2 hours later, I stood in the lake house living room, surrounded by FBI agents cataloging evidence. The charming cottage that had once represented Richard's betrayal now felt like the epicenter of something much larger. "Here," Agent Suarez said, leading me to a home office where a false wall had been discovered behind a bookshelf. This was hidden behind biometric security. We needed a warrant to bring in specialists to bypass it. The hidden room contained a sophisticated computer setup, filing cabinets, and a wall covered in photographs and documents connected by red string, like something from a spy movie. "What is all this?" I asked, overwhelmed. "Evidence of a conspiracy far beyond what we initially suspected," Agent Velez said, joining us. "This isn't just about the Novatech merger or falsified drug trials. Your husband and his associates have been systematically manipulating pharmaceutical stocks, trial data, and regulatory approvals for at least 5 years." He gestured to the wall of documents. "These are records of payoffs to clinical researchers, falsified patient data, and communications with regulatory insiders. The scope is unprecedented." I moved closer to examine the photographs. Richard and Thomas appeared in several, meeting with individuals identified by handwritten notes as FDA officials, research scientists, and executives from multiple pharmaceutical companies. But what truly stopped me cold was a framed photograph on the desk. Richard and Vanessa standing with an older woman I recognized as Dr. Hargrove, and a fourth person whose face I knew intimately. My father. What? I couldn't form a coherent question as I picked up the photograph with trembling hands. Agent Velez looked at the photo, then at me. "You recognize someone?" "This man." I pointed to my father's face. "Gregory Walsh. He's my father. He died 7 years ago, supposedly from complications of Parkinson's disease." "Walsh," Agent Suarez repeated, flipping through documents. "Here, Gregory Walsh, former director of pharmaceutical research at Meridian Laboratories, whistleblower in the ZD45 trial controversy, deceased 2018. "Whistleblower," I whispered. "According to these files, he threatened to expose falsified trial data for a Parkinson's drug produced by Meridian, which was later acquired by Westridge. He died before his evidence could be presented." The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications crystallized. My father hadn't died from Parkinson's complications. He had discovered fraud in drug trials, just as I had now uncovered with NV237. And Richard, who I'd met shortly after my father's death, had been there, connected to the very people my father had threatened to expose. The photograph was dated May 2018, 3 months before my father died. 3 months before Richard appeared in my life, the charming financial executive who'd swept me off my feet during the darkest period of my grief. "Mrs. Madigan," Agent Velez said gently, Was your relationship with Richard Madigan in any way connected to your father? I met Richard at a fundraiser for Parkinson's research, I said, my voice barely audible. It was the first event I attended after Dad died. Richard said he was there because his uncle had suffered from the disease. Agent Suarez exchanged glances with Velez. According to his background check, Richard has no family members with Parkinson's. The truth hit me with physical force, and I sank into the desk chair, still clutching the photograph. He targeted me, I whispered. All these years. Our entire marriage. It was never real. We don't know that for certain, Agent Velez cautioned. But I knew. With sudden, devastating clarity, I understood the central truth that explained everything. Richard hadn't married me for love. He'd married me to monitor the daughter of a whistleblower who might have inherited damaging information. He'd married me as corporate espionage. The betrayal was so complete, so overwhelming, that it transcended pain and entered some new territory of numbness. 15 years of my life, a marriage I had believed in despite its flaws, had been built on a foundation of calculated deception. Yet amid the devastation, a cold certainty emerged. The mortgage statement that had started this journey wasn't just evidence of Richard's infidelity or financial fraud. It was the thread that, when pulled, would unravel decades of pharmaceutical corruption. Corruption that had potentially cost my father his life. And that gave me something I hadn't expected to find in this lakeside house of lies: purpose. I stood, placing the photograph carefully back on the desk. I want to make a statement, I told Agent Velez, about everything. The fraud, the falsified trials, and what happened to my father. I want it on record. Are you sure? It's late. And this has been a shock. I'm sure, I said firmly. My father tried to expose this corruption and couldn't. I can, and I will. As Agent Velez prepared the recording equipment, I stared at the web of conspiracy laid out on the wall. Richard had never expected his quiet, trusting teacher wife to uncover this network of greed and deceit. He'd never anticipated that a simple mortgage statement would be his undoing. His fatal mistake was believing I was merely a convenient cover, rather than my father's daughter, a woman who would not rest until justice was served. Dawn broke over the lake as I finished giving my statement to the FBI. For nearly 3 hours, I had recounted everything I could remember about my father's research, his declining health, and his sudden death that had always felt somehow wrong, despite the doctor's assurances. Agent Velez had listened intently, occasionally consulting a tablet where he compared my recollections with the files found in the hidden room. The more we talked, the clearer the picture became. My father had discovered evidence of data manipulation in clinical trials for a drug called ZD45, meant to treat Parkinson's symptoms. When he'd threatened to go public, he'd suddenly developed complications and died within weeks. We'll need to exhume your father's body, Agent Velez said gently as we concluded. With your permission. I nodded, too emotionally exhausted to feel the full weight of that request. Whatever it takes to prove what they did. As FBI technicians continued processing the lake house, Agent Suarez drove me back to the Safe House Hotel. The rising sun cast long shadows across the landscape, reminding me that my students would be arriving at school soon, unaware their teacher was now at the center of a federal investigation into pharmaceutical fraud and potentially murder. Try to get some rest, Agent Suarez advised as we arrived. We'll have a protection detail outside your door. Don't open it for anyone except Agent Velez or myself. But sleep was impossible. My mind raced with everything I'd learned trying to reconstruct the past 15 years through this new, terrible lens. How much of my marriage had been real? Had Richard ever felt anything genuine for me? Or had every moment been calculated surveillance? I thought of our wedding day, Richard's seemingly heartfelt vows about building a life together, our 10th anniversary trip to Hawaii, where we'd watched the sunset and talked about growing old together. The nights he'd comforted me when I'd received news that my father's old colleague had died, or when I'd lost a promising student to a car accident. Had it all been an act? A long-term investment in keeping the whistleblower's daughter close and monitored? The more I reflected, the more patterns emerged. Richard had subtly discouraged me from pursuing administration positions at school that would have given me less time at home. He'd managed our finances with suspicious attention to detail, ensuring I remained dependent on his expertise. He'd even suggested I focus on teaching rather than completing the doctorate I'd once considered, keeping me intellectually occupied, but not advancing. By 10 a.m., despite my exhaustion, I had filled pages of notes in the hotel notepad, documenting every instance I could remember where Richard might have manipulated my career or our relationship to serve his purposes. A text arrived on the burner phone. "Turn on the news. Channel 7. I switched on the television to see Richard standing outside our home, looking appropriately distressed as reporters thrust microphones toward him. "My wife has been under tremendous stress lately," he was saying, his voice cracking, with apparent emotion. "Her behavior has become increasingly erratic. When she disappeared 2 days ago, I was frantic with worry. Now I learn she's making wild accusations about financial improprieties and corporate conspiracies." He paused, looking directly into the camera with the sincere expression I'd seen countless times across the dinner table. "Emma, if you're watching this, please come home. Whatever you think you've discovered, we can work through it together. You need help, not hiding." The reporter turned to the camera. Richard Madigan, CFO of Westridge Pharmaceuticals, making a public plea for his wife's return. Sources close to the family suggest Mrs. Madigan may be suffering from paranoid delusions. Meanwhile, Westridge Pharmaceuticals stock has dropped 11% amid rumors of regulatory scrutiny. I switched off the television, anger burning through my exhaustion. Richard was playing the concerned husband while simultaneously suggesting I was mentally unstable. A perfect strategy to discredit anything I might say about his activities. The burner phone rang. Agent Velez. "I assume you saw the news," he said without preamble. "Yes, he's painting me as delusional." "It's a predictable tactic, but it tells us something important. They're scared. A public statement like this is risky. It draws attention they'd normally avoid." "What's our next move?" I asked. "Our next move is continuing to build the case methodically," Velez replied. "Your next move, however, is something we need to discuss. Richard has filed for an emergency competency hearing, scheduled for tomorrow morning. He's seeking temporary guardianship over your affairs." My stomach dropped. "He can do that?" "He's claiming you've displayed erratic behavior, abandoned your home and job without explanation, and taken actions that put your financial security at risk." His attorney has statements from Thomas Blackwell and 2 other Westridge executives supporting these claims. "That's absurd. I'm perfectly competent." "We know that, but the court will need to make a determination. If Richard succeeds, he could gain control over your finances, medical decisions, and potentially even restrict your freedom of movement." The implications were chilling. Richard could legally prevent me from testifying against him or accessing evidence that might incriminate him. What do I do? "You need legal representation immediately, not just for criminal matters, but for the guardianship hearing. Someone who specializes in both corporate fraud and family law." "I can call Natalie. With all respect to your cousin, you need someone with more specialized experience. I've taken the liberty of contacting Diana Winters. She's a former prosecutor who now handles complex cases involving financial crimes and family law. She's willing to meet with you this afternoon." 4 hours later, I sat in a conference room at Diana Winters' law office, brought there via a circuitous route with FBI protection to ensure we weren't followed. Diana was a formidable woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that missed nothing. "You're in a precarious position, Mrs. Madigan," she said after reviewing my case. Your husband has significant resources and a compelling narrative, the concerned spouse dealing with a partner's mental health crisis. We need to counter that effectively without revealing the full extent of the FBI investigation prematurely. How do we do that? First, we demonstrate your competence. I'll arrange for an independent psychological evaluation this afternoon. Second, we establish a paper trail showing your rational decision-making. Third, we provide an alternative explanation for your absence that doesn't involve either mental instability or criminal accusations. Diana outlined a comprehensive strategy for the hearing. I would not mention the FBI investigation or the pharmaceutical fraud allegations. Instead, we would focus solely on the forged mortgage documents and Richard's affair, presenting my actions as those of a reasonably distressed spouse who needed space after discovering betrayal. The judge only needs to be convinced you're competent to manage your own affairs, Diana explained. We don't need to prove Richard's broader criminal activities at this hearing. In fact, keeping that separate works to our advantage. And after the hearing? I asked. After we defeat the guardianship petition, we move to protect your financial interests. I'll file for an emergency freeze on all marital assets and seek exclusive use of your personal accounts. Simultaneously, we'll work with the FBI to ensure the evidence you've provided is properly preserved for eventual criminal proceedings. By evening, I had undergone a thorough psychological evaluation with Dr. Harriet Lerner, a renowned forensic psychologist, who would testify about my mental competence. I had also drafted a detailed affidavit explaining my discovery of the mortgage fraud and my subsequent actions, carefully omitting any mention of the pharmaceutical conspiracy or my father's connection. Diana reviewed the document, making occasional suggestions. Remember, she cautioned, in court tomorrow, Richard's attorney will try to provoke an emotional response. They want you to appear unstable or vindictive. Remain calm and factual no matter what they allege. What if they bring up that I took documents from our home, the merger papers? We acknowledge it. You discovered financial impropriety affecting your home and marriage, and you secured documentation to protect yourself. That's rational self-preservation, not theft or corporate espionage. As night fell, I returned to the Safe House Hotel with Agent Suarez and a female FBI agent who would remain outside my door. Diana had provided me with appropriate courtroom attire, a conservative navy suit and minimal jewelry that projected competence and stability. Get some sleep, Diana advised before we parted. Tomorrow will be challenging, but we're well prepared. Sleep remained elusive. I kept imagining facing Richard across a courtroom, seeing the man I'd loved for 15 years now revealed as someone who had targeted me, married me under false pretenses, and was willing to have me declared incompetent to protect his criminal enterprise. Had he ever anticipated this moment? When he'd pursued me after my father's death, had he considered the possibility that one day I might discover the truth? Or had he been so confident in his manipulation that he never imagined his quiet, trusting wife would become his greatest threat? Around 3 a.m., unable to rest, I opened my laptop and began typing what I called my insurance document. It contained everything I knew about Richard Westridge, the falsified drug trials, and my father's whistleblowing. I included names, dates, connections, and observations from 15 years of marriage to a man I now realized had been my enemy. If anything happened to me, if Richard somehow succeeded in having me committed or silenced, this document would ensure the investigation continued. I encrypted it and set it to automatically send to Agent Velez, Diana Winters, Natalie, and 3 trusted journalist contacts if I didn't enter a passcode every 24 hours. It wasn't paranoia if they really were after you. And Richard had proven he would stop at nothing to protect himself and his conspirators. Morning arrived with a text from Diana. Car arriving in 30 minutes. Wear the navy suit. Bring only your ID and phone. I'll have all necessary documents. I dressed carefully, applied minimal makeup, and styled my hair in a conservative twist. The woman in the mirror looked nothing like the frightened, confused teacher who had opened a mortgage statement less than a week ago. She looked composed, determined. A woman prepared to fight. As I left the hotel room, Agent Suarez handed me a small object, a listening device disguised as a lapel pin. "For your protection," she said quietly. "We'll be monitoring the proceedings. If anything seems wrong or dangerous, use the phrase, 'I need to consult my calendar.' We'll intervene immediately." The gravity of the situation, that federal agents considered me at enough risk to require a panic phrase, should have terrified me. Instead, it steeled my resolve. Richard and his associates were powerful, desperate people with everything to lose. But they had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that discovering their betrayal would break me. Instead, it had transformed me. As the car pulled away toward the courthouse, I touched the lapel pin and thought of my father. The scientific integrity that had cost him his life, the principles he had instilled in me. Today's hearing was just the first battle in what would likely be a long war for justice. Richard wanted to declare me incompetent? Let him try. The mortgage statement that had revealed his betrayal had also revealed my advantage, the truth. And I was prepared to wield it with precision. The county courthouse loomed before me, its classical columns and stone steps suddenly intimidating. News vans lined the street. Richard's public plea had turned our private drama into local headline news. Perfect for his narrative. Concerned husband seeking help for his troubled wife. Head high, eyes forward, Diana murmured as we approached. The entrance. You're not hiding or ashamed because you've done nothing wrong. Cameras turned toward us as reporters recognized me from Richard's press conference. Shouted questions filled the air. "Mrs. Madigan, are you having a mental breakdown? Is it true you've stolen confidential documents from Westridge Pharmaceuticals? Why did you abandon your students without notice?" Diana raised a hand. "My client will not be commenting. We look forward to addressing these matters in the appropriate forum, the courtroom." Inside, we were directed to Family Court 3, where Richard's emergency guardianship petition would be heard. The corridor outside was crowded with dark suits, Westridge's legal team, I presumed. Among them stood Thomas Blackwell, who averted his eyes when he saw me. "Quite the army for a simple competency hearing," Diana observed dryly. "Almost as if there's more at stake than they're admitting." We entered the courtroom to find Richard already seated at the front with his attorney, Bradford Collins, a polished man in his 60s known for representing the city's elite in their most delicate legal matters. Richard looked up as we entered, his expression a perfect blend of concern and sorrow. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something flicker behind his mask. Surprise, perhaps, at my composed appearance. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Eliza Montgomery entered, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Be seated," she said briskly. "This is case number FC 2025-438, Richard Madigan versus Emma Madigan, petition for emergency temporary guardianship." She peered over her glasses. "I've reviewed the preliminary filings. This is most unusual, Mr. Collins. Emergency guardianship is typically reserved for cases of severe incapacitation." Bradford Collins rose smoothly. "Your Honor, this is indeed an unusual and urgent situation. Mrs. Madigan has displayed increasingly erratic behavior culminating in her disappearance from the family home, abandonment of her teaching position without notice, and theft of confidential corporate documents from my client. We believe she is experiencing a psychological break and requires immediate intervention for her own protection." "And you, Ms. Winters?" The judge turned to Diana. "Your Honor, this petition is nothing more than an attempt to silence my client after she discovered her husband's infidelity and financial fraud. Mrs. Madigan is perfectly competent, as our expert witness will testify. She left the marital home after finding evidence Mr. Madigan had forged her signature on a significant mortgage document and was using those funds to support his mistress. Judge Montgomery's eyebrows rose slightly. Serious allegations on both sides. Let's proceed methodically. Mr. Collins, present your case. What followed was a masterclass in character assassination disguised as concern. Bradford Collins called Richard to the stand first, where he testified with apparent reluctance about my troubling behavior over the past 6 months. Emma has always been so devoted to her students, Richard said, his voice carefully modulated to convey worry. But recently, she's become fixated on conspiracy theories about pharmaceutical companies. She's been having trouble sleeping, becoming increasingly paranoid about our finances despite my attempts to reassure her. And the events of the past week? Collins prompted. I came home to find she'd broken into my briefcase and taken confidential merger documents. When I tried to explain they were sensitive corporate materials, she accused me of fraud and storming out. The next day, she didn't show up for work. No call, no explanation. Her colleagues were concerned. I was frantic. Richard dabbed at his eye with a handkerchief, a gesture I'd never seen from him in 15 years of marriage. I later learned she'd accessed our accounts, withdrawn funds, and was making wild accusations at our bank. When I tried to reach her, she refused my calls. Then she disappeared completely. Judge Montgomery turned to Diana. Cross-examination? Diana approached the witness stand with measured steps. Mr. Madigan, you've painted a concerning picture of your wife's mental state. Tell me, during this period of alleged psychological decline, did you suggest she seek professional help? Richard shifted slightly. I tried to broach the subject delicately. Emma is sensitive about such things. Did you contact her physician, schedule an appointment with a therapist, reach out to her family with your concerns? I didn't want to embarrass her, Richard replied. I hoped it would pass. Interesting, Diana said. So concerned about her mental health that you're seeking legal control over her entire life, yet not concerned enough to have pursued any actual medical intervention. She switched tactics abruptly. Mr. Madigan, do you own a property at 1857? Lakeview Drive? Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not personally. It's owned by an investment LLC, I advise. And who lives at this property? I believe it's currently vacant. It's an investment holding. Diana nodded to the bailiff, who handed her a folder. I have here utility bills for that property showing continuous usage for the past 3 months, as well as meal delivery. Receipts addressed to Vanessa Hargrove. Is Ms. Hargrove your investment advisor? She's a business associate, Richard said carefully. A business associate with whom you've been having an intimate relationship, correct? Bradford Collins stood. Objection. Relevance? Your Honor, Diana countered. Mr. Madigan's credibility is directly relevant. He's portraying my client as delusional for, among other things, suspecting financial impropriety and infidelity, both of which appear to be factual. I'll allow it, Judge Montgomery said. Answer the question, Mr. Madigan. Richard hesitated, visibly calculating his options. Vanessa and I have a professional relationship that has occasionally extended to personal matters. By personal matters, do you mean sexual relations? His face flushed slightly. Our relationship is complex. I'm sure it is, Diana said, dryly. Mr. Madigan, did you take out a second mortgage on your home with Mrs. Madigan 3 months ago? Yes, for investment purposes. Emma signed the paperwork. Diana approached with another document. This is a handwriting analysis from Riverside Federal Credit Union comparing the signature on those mortgage documents with known samples of my client's signature. Their expert concluded the mortgage signatures were forgeries. Did you forge your wife's signature, Mr. Madigan? Absolutely not, Richard said firmly. Emma signed those papers. She's simply forgotten or is choosing not to remember. 1. Final question, Diana said. The funds from this mortgage, approximately $245,000, were transferred to Sunnybrook LLC for the purchase of the Lakeview Drive property where your mistress resides. An additional $175,000 was wired to offshore accounts. Can you explain these transactions? Collins jumped to his feet. Objection. This hearing is about Mrs. Madigan's competency, not my client's financial dealings. Your Honor, Diana replied, Mr. Madigan is claiming my client is delusional for believing he committed financial fraud. These transactions directly contradict his testimony. Judge Montgomery considered briefly. I'll allow it for the limited purpose of assessing the reasonableness of Mrs. Madigan's beliefs and actions. Answer the question, Mr. Madigan. Richard's calm facade cracked slightly. Those transfers were legitimate business investments. Emma is mischaracterizing them because she's unwell. Diana returned to our table, having planted the first seeds of doubt about Richard's narrative. Next, Collins called Thomas Blackwell, who testified about my confused appearance at the hotel and paranoid accusations about being followed. Under Diana's cross-examination, however, he was forced to admit he had no medical qualifications to assess mental health and had entered my hotel room under false pretenses. Mr. Blackwell, Diana asked pointedly, why were you so determined to locate Mrs. Madigan that you misrepresented yourself to hotel security? Richard was concerned for her safety, he replied stiffly. So concerned that instead of calling the police to perform a welfare check, he sent his business colleague to track her down? Thomas glanced at Richard before answering. He trusted me to handle the situation discreetly. One last question, Mr. Blackwell. Do you regularly visit the property at 1857 Lakeview Drive? His expression froze. I've been there for business meetings. With whom? Various colleagues. Including Dr. Eleanor Hargrove of Novatech Biologics? The courtroom fell silent. Thomas's eyes darted to Richard, who had gone rigid in his seat. I believe she may have attended one meeting, Thomas said carefully. When our turn came to present evidence, Diana first called Dr. Harriet Lerner, who testified about my comprehensive psychological evaluation. Mrs. Madigan shows no signs of delusional thinking, paranoia, or any other condition that would impair her judgment, Dr. Lerner stated firmly. She is understandably distressed by her recent discoveries about her marriage, but her responses are entirely rational under the circumstances. Next came Howard Bennett from Riverside Federal Credit Union, who confirmed their investigation had concluded my signatures on the mortgage documents were forgeries. He also testified about the suspicious wire transfers to offshore accounts. In your professional opinion, Diana asked, would someone who discovered these transactions have legitimate cause for concern? Absolutely, Bennett replied. These patterns are consistent with potential financial fraud. We've already filed suspicious activity reports with regulatory authorities. Finally, it was my turn to testify. As I took the oath, I felt Richard's eyes on me, calculating, assessing the threat I now posed. Diana began gently. Mrs. Madigan, could you tell the court about the events that led you to leave your home earlier this week? I spoke clearly, maintaining eye contact with Judge Montgomery as I recounted discovering the mortgage statement, confronting Richard, finding evidence of the lake house and Vanessa, and learning about the offshore transfers. I was afraid, I concluded. My husband had forged my signature on legal documents, hidden significant financial transactions, and when confronted, became threatening. I left because I feared for my safety and needed time to understand what was happening to my life. Did you take documents from your husband's briefcase? Diana asked. Yes, I admitted. After discovering he had forged my signature and potentially committed fraud using our home equity, I felt I needed to protect myself by understanding exactly what I was dealing with. During cross-examination, Bradford Collins tried repeatedly to portray my actions as irrational. Mrs. Madigan, instead of discussing your concerns with your husband, you broke into his briefcase, fled your home, abandoned your students, and hid from your concerned family. Does that sound like reasonable behavior to you? When you discover your spouse of 15 years has been lying to you about fundamental aspects of your financial life and personal relationship, reasonable behavior changes, I replied evenly. I didn't feel safe confronting him further without understanding the full situation. And these conspiracy theories about pharmaceutical fraud? Your husband's colleagues have testified you've become fixated on these delusions. I met Richard's gaze directly for the first time. I haven't testified about any pharmaceutical fraud allegations in this hearing, Mr. Collins. That appears to be your client's preoccupation, not mine. A flicker of alarm crossed Richard's face as he realized his strategy had backfired. By introducing the pharmaceutical fraud allegations himself, Collins had opened a door I hadn't even approached. My concerns were strictly about the forged mortgage, the misappropriated funds, and my husband's affair, I continued. If there are broader issues at Westridge Pharmaceuticals, perhaps that explains why my husband is so desperate to discredit me. After both sides rested, Judge Montgomery called a brief recess to review the evidence. In the hallway outside, Diana squeezed my arm encouragingly. You did well. Very well. Across the corridor, Richard huddled with Collins and Thomas, their expressions tense. Additional men in suits whom I recognized as Westridge executives had joined them, including Patricia Wright, the CEO. Their presence at what should have been a simple competency hearing spoke volumes about what was really at stake. When court resumed, Judge Montgomery removed her glasses and addressed the room. This court takes guardianship matters extremely seriously. Removing an individual's autonomy is among the most severe actions we can take, justified only by clear evidence of incapacity. What I've seen today is not evidence of Mrs. Madigan's incapacity, but rather a troubling attempt to use this court to silence and control her. Richard's face hardened as she continued. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied. Furthermore, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order, preventing Mr. Madigan from accessing any joint accounts or properties until the underlying financial allegations can be properly investigated. Mrs. Madigan shall have exclusive use of her personal accounts and access to necessary marital assets for living expenses. She tapped her gavel. Court adjourned. The victory was swift and unambiguous. Diana shook my hand firmly as Richard and his entourage quickly exited, their faces grim. This is just the beginning, Diana cautioned as we gathered our materials. Richard will regroup and try another approach, but we've won a crucial battle. You remain legally autonomous and financially protected. As we left the courtroom, I noticed Agent Velez sitting in the back row. He gave me a subtle nod of approval before disappearing into the corridor. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters surged forward, now eager for my side of the story. Diana stepped up to the microphones. Today's ruling speaks for itself. The court has recognized that Emma Madigan is a competent individual who took reasonable actions after discovering disturbing financial irregularities and personal betrayal. We will have no further comment as various investigations continue. As we moved toward our waiting car, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see Darlene from school, pushing through the crowd. Emma! She embraced me fiercely. We've all been so worried. The things they're saying about you on the news, we knew it couldn't be true. Her simple faith in me after years of friendship brought the first tears I'd allowed myself since this ordeal began. I'm okay, I assured her. It's complicated, but I'm okay. The whole department is behind you, Darlene said firmly. Whatever you need. As Diana ushered me into the car, I caught sight of Richard watching from the shadow of a pillar, his expression unreadable. Our eyes locked briefly before the car door closed. The man I'd married, the stranger who had infiltrated my life for reasons I was only beginning to understand, had underestimated me profoundly. He had expected his quiet, trusting wife to crumble under pressure, to appear unstable and vindictive. Instead, I had met him as an equal in the arena he thought he controlled, and I had won the first round. But as we drove away from the courthouse, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Richard and his Westridge colleagues wouldn't simply accept defeat, not with billions of dollars and potential criminal charges at stake. They would come after me again, and when they did, I would be ready. The safe house Diana took me to after the hearing was a far cry from the anonymous hotel room I'd been staying in. A comfortable lakeside cabin owned by her family, secluded enough for privacy but only 30 minutes from the city. As evening settled over the water, we sat on the deck with Agent Velez, developing our next steps. "Richard will be scrambling right now," Diana said, swirling a glass of Merlot. "The guardianship gambit failed spectacularly. Judge Montgomery's ruling not only preserved your autonomy, but actively restricted his access to your joint finances." "He won't give up," I said. "There's too much at stake." Agent Velez nodded. "We've been monitoring communications among key Westridge executives since your discovery at the lake house. There was an emergency board meeting called immediately after the hearing today. Do you know what was discussed?" "Not specifically, but we have informants inside Westridge who report Richard has been temporarily removed from financial duties pending an internal review." This news should have felt like victory, but instead it unsettled me. "That's too convenient. Richard knows too much about their operations. They wouldn't sideline him unless they're preparing him as a scapegoat," Diana finished. My thought. "Sacrifice the CFO to protect the company. Classic corporate strategy," Velez agreed. "Distance the organization from the bad actor while quietly containing the damage." I stood, too restless to remain seated. "What about Novatech? And the falsified drug trial data? If they're trying to make this all about Richard's personal, financial misconduct, what happens to the patients who would receive an ineffective drug?" "That's where you become especially dangerous to them," Diana said. "You're not just a witness to financial fraud, you're potentially a whistleblower about patient safety issues, like your father." The mention of my father sent a fresh wave of grief through me. For 7 years, I'd believed he died from disease progression. Now I had to process not only his murder, but the possibility that the man I married had been connected to it. "The exhumation request has been approved," Agent Velez said gently, reading my expression. "The medical examiner will conduct a thorough toxicology analysis. If your father was poisoned, we'll find evidence." "What's our next move?" I asked, bringing the conversation back to immediate strategy. "We need to secure additional evidence before Westridge can destroy it," Velez replied. "Our search warrants covered the lake house and Ridgemont Partners commercial property, but we need internal company documents about the Novatech acquisition and the NV-237 trial data." "Wouldn't Richard have secured or destroyed anything incriminating by now?" "Possibly. But corporations generate mountains of documentation. Emails, meeting minutes, preliminary reports. It's virtually impossible to erase every trace, especially in a highly regulated industry like pharmaceuticals." Diana leaned forward. "What we need is leverage. Someone inside Westridge or Novatech with access and motivation to cooperate." A face flashed in my mind. "Patricia Wright." "The CEO?" Velez looked skeptical. "She's likely at the center of this conspiracy." "Maybe. But at the courthouse today, I saw her expression when Richard's legal team was huddling after the hearing. She looked furious, not concerned or worried, specifically angry at Richard." "Interesting," Diana mused. "A rift between conspirators?" "More than that," I said, thinking back to interactions I'd witnessed over the years at company functions. "Patricia built Westridge from a small regional player into a national company. It's her legacy. Richard is ambitious, relatively new to the executive team. What if this scheme wasn't her idea? What if Richard and Thomas went rogue, putting her company at risk?" Agent Velez typed a note into his phone. "We'll investigate that angle." If there's discord among the leadership, we might find an opening. As darkness fell over the lake, we continued planning. Diana would file motions to freeze additional assets Richard might control through his shell companies. Agent Velez would coordinate with SEC investigators to examine Westridge's financial disclosures around the Novatech acquisition. And I would help identify potential witnesses from my years of attending company functions as Richard's wife. After they left, I stood, alone on the deck, watching moonlight shimmer across the water. The lake reminded me of the one visible from the house Richard had purchased for Vanessa, a betrayal that now seemed almost quaint compared to what I'd since discovered. My phone, a new secure device provided by the FBI, chimed with a message. From an unknown number. Need to talk. Information about your father. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Riverfront Park near the boat launch. Come alone. I immediately forwarded it to Agent Velez with the message. Is this a trap? His response came quickly. Almost certainly. We'll set up surveillance. Play along, but don't commit to anything. I responded to the mysterious texter. Who is this? The reply was immediate. Someone who knew Gregory Walsh, someone who owes him. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept thinking about my father, his integrity, his dedication to scientific truth, his gentle encouragement of my teaching career. Had he known Richard was watching me after his death? Had he tried to warn me in ways I'd missed? Morning brought a flurry of developments. Diana called early with news that the court had approved additional asset freezes on Richard's known accounts. Agent Velez reported that surveillance was already being set up at Riverfront Park, and the local news was running a story about turmoil at Westridge Pharmaceuticals amid allegations of financial impropriety. At 9:30, I arrived at the park, wearing a concealed wire and the same lapel pin listening device from the courthouse. Agent Velez had agents positioned throughout the area, and a surveillance van was parked discreetly near the playground. We'll be monitoring everything, he assured me. If anything feels wrong, use the code phrase and walk toward the playground. I sat on a bench overlooking the river, watching joggers and dog walkers enjoying the morning sunshine. At precisely 10 a.m., a woman sat down beside me, not Vanessa Hargrove or Dr. Eleanor Hargrove as I'd half expected, but someone entirely unfamiliar. Middle-aged, with auburn hair pulled into a practical bun, she wore a lab coat under her open jacket. Mrs. Madigan, she said quietly, not looking at me. Thank you for coming. Who are you? Dr. Laura Sandoval. I worked with your father at Meridian Laboratories before Westridge acquired us. I was his research partner on the ZD45 trials. My pulse quickened. You knew about the falsified data? She nodded almost imperceptibly. Gregory discovered discrepancies in patient response rates. The drug wasn't working as claimed, but management was pressuring us to produce positive results. When he threatened to go public, they isolated him professionally. Then he got sick so suddenly. You suspected foul play? I knew, she said flatly. Greg had no family history of Parkinson's. His symptoms appeared and progressed far too rapidly for typical disease presentation. But I had no proof, and after his death, the company buried the trial issues. I was transferred, demoted, eventually sidelined to quality control. Why come forward now, after 7 years? Dr. Sandoval finally turned to look at me directly. Because it's happening again with NV237, another promising drug that doesn't work, another cover-up. But this time, they're going further, a massive merger based on fraudulent data. Thousands of patients could receive ineffective treatment for advanced cancers. I can't have that on my conscience, too. What exactly are you offering? Documentation, she said. I've been quietly collecting evidence since your father died. Records of the original ZD45 trial manipulation, internal memos about handling data outliers, communications regarding the Novatech acquisition. I kept thinking someday I could bring it all to light, but I didn't have the courage your father had. She reached into her bag and withdrew a thumb drive. Everything's here. Use it to finish what Greg started. As I reached for the drive, she held it back momentarily. There's something else you should know. About Richard. What about him? He wasn't just assigned to monitor you after your father's death. He specifically volunteered for the role. Something about your father's work fascinated him. Not just the financial implications, but the science itself. Richard has a background in biochemistry before he switched to finance. Few people at Westridge know that. This new piece of information sent my mind racing. Richard with scientific knowledge beyond his financial expertise? It added another dimension to his deception, and potentially to his motives. Thank you, I said, taking the thumb drive. But why help me now? Why not go directly to the authorities yourself? Because they've been watching me for years. My communications, my movements, I'm too compromised. But you, she smiled slightly. You they underestimated. The teacher widow beyond suspicion. Your father would be proud. Dr. Sandoval stood. I should go. They can't know we've spoken. Wait. Will you testify if needed? Make an official statement? She hesitated. If it comes to that. But use the evidence first. It speaks for itself. I watched her walk away, disappearing among morning park-goers before heading toward the playground as planned. Agent Velez met me at the surveillance. Van, we got everything, he confirmed. We'll need to verify Dr. Sandoval's identity and credibility. But if her documentation checks out, this could break the case wide open. Back at Diana's cabin, we connected the thumb drive to a secure laptop. It contained years of meticulously organized files, clinical data, email chains, meeting minutes, and most damning of all, a folder labeled Walsh Project with detailed surveillance reports on me dating back to my father's funeral. My God, Diana murmured as we scrolled through my life, documented in cold corporate language. They've been watching you for years. Your job applications, medical appointments, even your decision not to pursue your doctorate. They tracked everything. And Richard reported it all, I said, throat tight with betrayal. The file contained regular updates from RM detailing our relationship milestones, my activities, even private conversations we'd had in our bedroom. Agent Velez was focused on a different folder. The NV-237 documentation is extraordinary. Original lab results showing 23% efficacy, then revised reports claiming 68%. Emails discussing how to reconcile the data disparities. A memo from Thomas Blackwell explicitly directing researchers to focus on positive response cohorts and contextualize adverse events as unrelated to treatment. Criminal fraud, Diana said. And if the FDA approval process was corrupted? Multiple federal violations, Velez finished. This is exactly what we needed. As they continued analyzing the evidence, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. Should I answer? I asked Velez. He nodded. On speaker. Hello? I answered cautiously. Mrs. Madigan. The voice was female, authoritative, and vaguely familiar. This is Patricia Wright. I exchanged surprised glances with Velez and Diana. The CEO of Westridge calling me directly had not been on our bingo card of possibilities. Ms. Wright, I replied neutrally. This is unexpected. I imagine so. I'd like to meet with you, privately. I don't think that would be wise. I understand your caution, she said, but I believe we may have aligned interests at this point. Your husband has created a situation that threatens my company, our shareholders, and potentially patients who rely on our medications. You're suggesting Richard acted without your knowledge? I kept my tone skeptical. I'm suggesting that the full scope of Richard's activities was concealed from the board and from me. I've spent 30 years building Westridge into a company that improves lives. I won't let Richard Madigan and Thomas Blackwell destroy that. Legacy through greed and corner-cutting. Agent Velez scribbled a note. Throwing them under the bus? Or trying to identify what you know? Why contact me directly? I asked. Surely you have attorneys for situations like this. Attorneys would observe corporate protocols that would delay resolution. This situation requires expediency. You've proven yourself more resourceful than anyone anticipated, Mrs. Madigan. And you have access to documentation that could either destroy Westridge entirely or help us excise the cancer within our organization. What exactly are you proposing? A conversation, just the two of us, about how to handle this situation in a way that serves justice without unnecessarily harming thousands of employees and patients who depend on Westridge's legitimate medications. Agent Velez was shaking his head vigorously, but Diana raised a hand, looking thoughtful. When and where? I asked. My private residence. This evening at 7. I'll text you the address. Patricia's voice softened slightly. Mrs. Madigan, Emma, I knew your father. Gregory Walsh was a scientist of uncommon integrity. What happened to him was unconscionable. I give you my word that I had no knowledge of or involvement in those events. After ending the call, a heated debate erupted. Absolutely not, Agent Velez said firmly. It's too dangerous. She's trying to contain the situation. Or she's genuinely trying to salvage her company while distancing herself from criminal activity, Diana countered. Either way, it gives us access we wouldn't otherwise have. We already have Dr. Sandoval's evidence. We don't need to risk Emma's safety. I listened to them argue, my mind working through the implications. Patricia, Wright had built Westridge from nothing. Her reputation was spotless. Philanthropic work, industry leadership awards, even a presidential appointment to a healthcare advisory council. Would she risk everything to cover up fraud? Or was she truly blindsided by Richard's schemes? I'll meet with her, I decided finally, but not at her home, neutral territory with proper security precautions. Agent Velez reluctantly agreed, and Diana suggested her law office, secure, monitored, and private. We contacted Patricia with the counter-proposal, which she accepted after brief consideration. As evening approached, I prepared for what could be the most consequential meeting of this entire ordeal. Diana helped me select appropriate attire, professional but not intimidating, while Agent Velez briefed me on negotiation tactics. She'll try to minimize institutional involvement, he predicted. Frame Richard and Thomas as rogue actors. Be skeptical of any narrative that completely absolves the company leadership. And if she offers a deal? I asked. Listen, but commit to nothing, Diana advised. Any legitimate cooperation agreement would need to be formalized through proper channels, SEC, FBI, and the Justice Department. At 6:45, I arrived at Diana's office building. Security protocols were extensive. A full sweep for surveillance devices, armed agents positioned discreetly throughout the floor, and a panic button installed under the conference table at my seat. Patricia Wright arrived precisely at 7, alone, as promised. She was smaller in person than she appeared in media coverage, barely 5 feet tall, with silver-streaked black hair and penetrating dark eyes. Despite the circumstances, she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. Mrs. Madigan, she greeted me with a firm handshake. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Ms. Wright, I replied, I believe you have something to discuss. She took a seat across from me, placing a slim portfolio on the table between us. I'll be direct. Richard Madigan and Thomas Blackwell have engaged in criminal activity that threatens everything Westridge stands for. I've spent today reviewing internal documentation and speaking with board members. The situation is more severe than I initially understood. When did you become aware of the issues with the Novatech acquisition? I asked. 3 days ago. When Riverside Federal Credit Union contacted our compliance department about suspicious wire transfers Richard had authorized. That triggered an internal review, which uncovered irregularities in the Novatech due diligence process. And the falsified efficacy data for NV237? Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. You're well informed. Yes, we've discovered discrepancies in the trial data Novatech provided. That's actually why I wanted to meet with you urgently. If Novatech has been misrepresenting their research results, Westridge cannot proceed with this acquisition. Yet, your company was preparing to do exactly that, I noted. With Richard and Thomas leading the process. They concealed the data issues from the board and from me, Patricia insisted. Richard controlled the financial due diligence. Thomas managed the scientific review. They presented a unified front, assuring us the acquisition was sound. Why would they risk their careers and freedom for this? Patricia opened her portfolio and slid a document toward me. This is the compensation structure for the Novatech acquisition team. Richard and Thomas stood to receive 8-figure bonuses upon successful completion. Additionally, they had established hidden ownership stakes in Novatech through offshore entities. The acquisition would have made them extraordinarily wealthy. I examined the document, recognizing elements I'd already seen in Richard's papers. And what about Dr. Eleanor Hargrove's role? Or her daughter Vanessa's? A flicker of surprise crossed Patricia's face. You are thorough, Mrs. Madigan. Dr. Hargrove was Novatech's scientific guarantor. Her FDA background lent credibility to their approval pathway. Vanessa served as the covert liaison between all parties. And you knew nothing about any of this, despite being CEO? Patricia's expression hardened. Mrs. Madigan, I run a pharmaceutical company with over 15,000 employees and dozens of products. I rely on my executive team to manage their divisions with integrity. Richard abused that trust catastrophically. She leaned forward. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because Westridge produces medications that millions of patients depend on. If this scandal brings down the entire company, those patients suffer. I want to make this right. Hold the guilty parties accountable while preserving the legitimate operations of Westridge. What exactly are you proposing? Full cooperation with authorities. Complete transparency about the Novatech fraud. Internal documentation that will help build cases against Richard, Thomas, the Hargroves, and anyone else involved. In exchange, the government typically considers deferred prosecution agreements for corporations that self-report and cooperate. It sounded reasonable on the surface, isolate the bad actors while preserving the company. But something didn't quite add up. What about my father? I asked quietly. Gregory Walsh discovered similar fraud 7 years ago and died for it. Were you unaware of that situation too? Patricia's composure faltered momentarily. Your father's death was a tragedy. The official cause was— I know what the official cause was, I interrupted. I'm asking what you knew about the circumstances. She met my gaze directly. I knew he had raised concerns about data integrity in the ZD45 trials. I did not know those concerns were ignored or that anything suspicious surrounded his death until recent revelations. Gregory Walsh was a scientist of tremendous integrity. Had I known then what I know now, I would have acted differently. And now you want my help to save your company? I want your help to ensure justice is served appropriately. Richard Madigan infiltrated your life, betrayed your trust, and has connections to your father's death. Shouldn't he be the focus of accountability rather than thousands of innocent employees? It was a compelling argument, and exactly what Agent Velez had predicted she would say. The question was whether it contained any truth. I'll consider what you've said, I replied. But any cooperation would need to be formalized through proper legal channels. Patricia nodded, apparently satisfied with this non-commitment. Of course, my attorneys can connect with the appropriate authorities. She stood to leave, then hesitated. "Mrs. Madigan, there's something else you should know. Richard has disappeared." "What do you mean disappeared?" "After the board suspended him this morning, he cleaned out his office and hasn't been seen since. His passport was recently used at Toronto International Airport. We believe he's attempting to flee to a non-extradition country." As Patricia departed, Agent Velez and Diana emerged from the adjacent room where they had monitored the conversation. "She's throwing Richard to the wolves," Diana observed. "Classic corporate strategy. Isolate the problem. Preserve the institution." "But is she telling the truth about her own involvement?" I wondered. "And what about Richard fleeing the country?" Agent Velez was already on his phone. "I'm checking on the passport usage now." After a brief conversation, he turned back to us. "Confirmed. Richard's passport was scanned in Toronto 3 hours ago. We're coordinating with Canadian authorities, but if he makes a connection to certain destinations, extradition becomes complicated." The implications were staggering. Richard, my husband of 15 years, was now an international fugitive. The man who had shared my bed, my home, my life, had abandoned everything to escape justice. "What does this mean for our case?" I asked. "It actually strengthens it," Diana said. "Flight suggests consciousness of guilt, and with Patricia Wright apparently willing to cooperate, we may have access to internal Westridge documentation we couldn't have obtained otherwise." Agent Velez nodded. "Between Dr. Sandoval's evidence, the Lake House documents, and potentially Westridge's cooperation, we have a strong case regardless of whether we apprehend Richard immediately." As they discussed next steps, I moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Richard was running from the life he'd built on deception. The husband I thought I knew had never existed, just a carefully constructed facade designed to monitor the daughter of a man who threatened to expose corporate fraud. Yet in his desperation to silence me, Richard had made a crucial error. The mortgage statement that revealed his financial betrayal had become the thread that, when pulled, unraveled his entire scheme. His attempt to control me through guardianship had backfired spectacularly, bringing scrutiny he couldn't withstand. The power had shifted irrevocably. From victim to witness to whistleblower, I had transformed in ways Richard never anticipated. And now, armed with evidence, allies, and the truth about my father, I would ensure that justice was finally served, with or without Richard present to face it. The 3 weeks following Richard's flight from the country unfolded at a dizzying pace. The evidence provided by Dr. Sandoval, combined with the documentation from the Lake House and Patricia Wright's cooperation, triggered multiple investigations spanning several federal agencies. I remained at Diana's lakeside cabin, only venturing out for necessary meetings with investigators and attorneys. My leave of absence from teaching had been extended through the end of the semester, with the school administration now fully aware of the extraordinary circumstances. My students sent a massive card signed by all my classes, their innocent messages of support bringing unexpected tears to my eyes. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Agent Velez arrived with news I had been both anticipating and dreading. "The medical examiner has completed the analysis of your father's remains," he said, his expression solemn. "They found conclusive evidence of thallium poisoning, a toxic heavy metal that can mimic neurological disease symptoms. The levels were far too high to be environmental or accidental." Though I had suspected this truth for weeks, hearing it confirmed hit me with physical force. I sank into a chair, a strange mixture of vindication and grief washing over me. "So it's officially murder," I said quietly. "Yes. The FBI has opened a formal homicide investigation. Your father's death has been reclassified as a homicide, with Richard Madigan and Thomas Blackwell as primary suspects. What about the others? Dr. Hargrove? Vanessa? We're building cases against all parties involved. The evidence suggests a conspiracy that extended beyond Richard and Thomas, though determining exact knowledge and participation will require further investigation. Agent Velez handed me a folder. There's something else you should see. We've been tracking Richard's movements prior to his escape. Inside were photographs of Richard at various locations, entering Westridge headquarters, meeting Thomas at a restaurant, visiting what appeared to be a storage facility. The final image showed him at the airport, his appearance subtly altered with glasses and a hat. He planned his escape methodically, Velez explained. Liquidated assets we hadn't yet frozen, secured alternative identification, mapped a route, through countries with complicated extradition protocols. Do you know where he is now? We believe he traveled from Toronto to Dubai, then to a small island nation in the South Pacific that has limited diplomatic relations with the United States. We're working through Interpol, but apprehension may take time. The thought of Richard living freely on a tropical island while my father lay in a reinterred grave made my blood boil. But there was a certain justice in his situation, too. The sophisticated executive, now a fugitive, cut off from his career, his connections, his carefully constructed life. What happens now with the investigations? I asked. The SEC has suspended trading of Westridge stock pending their investigation. The FDA has halted the approval process for NV237 and is reviewing other Novatech products, and the Justice Department is convening a grand jury to consider indictments against multiple executives. As Agent Velez spoke, my phone buzzed with a message from Diana. Turn on Channel 7 now. I grabbed the remote and switched on the television. To see Thomas Blackwell being led from Westridge headquarters in handcuffs, FBI agents flanking him as he ducked his head from news cameras. The anchor's voice filled the room. Breaking news in the expanding Westridge Pharmaceuticals scandal. Thomas Blackwell, Executive Vice President of Research and Development, has been arrested on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Sources close to the investigation tell us Blackwell may also face questioning regarding the death of a former Meridian Laboratories researcher, though authorities have not confirmed this connection. The broadcast cut to Patricia Wright at a hastily arranged press conference, her expression grim but composed. Westridge Pharmaceuticals is cooperating fully with all investigations, she stated firmly. The actions of a few individuals do not represent the values or practices of our company as a whole. We are committed to transparency, to understanding exactly what happened, and to making it right. A reporter shouted from the crowd, Ms. Wright, what about allegations that falsified drug trial data put patients at risk? Patricia's mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of genuine distress. Patient safety is our absolute priority. We are conducting a comprehensive review of all research data associated with the individuals under investigation. Any product with questionable efficacy or safety data will be immediately identified and addressed. Agent Velez muted the television. Patricia Wright is walking a tightrope, trying to salvage her company while distancing it from criminal activity. Our analysts are divided on whether she knew about the data manipulation. What's your assessment? I asked. He considered carefully. The evidence suggests she may have been willfully blind rather than actively complicit. As CEO, she created an environment where results mattered more than methods. She didn't want to know how her executives achieved those results. Plausible deniability, I murmured. Exactly. Criminal negligence at minimum, though proving she had specific knowledge will be challenging. Later that afternoon, Diana arrived with updates on the civil aspects of my case. The judge had ruled completely in my favor regarding the fraudulent mortgage, voiding it entirely and ordering Riverside Federal Credit Union to remove it from our property records. The bank is pursuing separate action against Richard for fraud, Diana explained. They've already reversed the transfers to the offshore accounts they could reach, though some funds remain inaccessible. What about the lake house? I asked. Since it was purchased with fraudulently obtained funds, the court has frozen the property pending final resolution. Given the circumstances, it will likely be liquidated with proceeds returned to you as the injured party. And our primary residence? The house in Oak Ridge Estates? Diana smiled slightly. That's where things get interesting. As Richard's spouse, you're entitled to your share of marital assets. However, given his flight to avoid prosecution, the court has granted you exclusive ownership and use of the property. Richard's half-interest will be held in escrow pending his return and adjudication of the criminal charges. So I essentially own the house now? For all practical purposes, yes. You can live there, maintain it, even sell it if you choose, though proceeds from Richard's portion would remain in escrow. The irony wasn't lost on me. The home where Richard had manipulated and monitored me for 15 years was now mine. Alone. I don't want to live there, I said decisively. Too many memories. Too many lies. You could sell it, Diana suggested. Use the proceeds to start fresh somewhere else. The idea of a completely new beginning was appealing. A home, chosen by me, for me, without Richard's influence or deception. I'll think about it, I promised. 2 days later, I faced another significant meeting, this time at the offices of Hanson, Bradford & Cole, the prestigious law firm representing Westridge Pharmaceuticals. Patricia Wright had requested a private conversation, and after consultation, with both Diana and Agent Velez, I had agreed. The firm's reception area exuded wealth and power. Marble floors, original artwork, hushed voices. A young associate escorted me to a conference room where Patricia waited alone, a stark contrast to the multiple attorneys I had expected. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Madigan," she said, rising to shake my hand. "I appreciate your willingness to speak directly, especially given all that's happened." "What did you want to discuss?" I asked, maintaining the professional distance Diana had advised. Patricia gestured to the chair across from her. "I wanted to provide you with information you deserve to have about your father, about Richard's role, and about steps Westridge is taking to address the damage done." She placed a leather portfolio on the table. "These are internal documents related to the ZD45 trial your father worked on. They confirm his assertions about data manipulation and reveal communications among certain executives regarding his troubling ethical concerns, as they put it." I opened the portfolio, scanning memos and emails that validated everything we had suspected about my father's whistleblowing efforts. "Why are you giving me these?" "Because you deserve to know the truth," Patricia replied. "And because transparency is the only path forward for Westridge. We can't undo what happened to your father, but we can acknowledge it and ensure it never happens again." Her words sounded sincere, but I remained skeptical. "These documents implicate Thomas Blackwell and several researchers, but conveniently, avoid mentioning your involvement." Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "Because I wasn't involved, Mrs. Madigan. As I've maintained consistently, I created a culture that valued results over process, a significant failure of leadership I'm now addressing. But I never directed or knowingly permitted data falsification, or certainly not anything approaching the harm that came to your father." She leaned forward, her voice lowering. "What I did do was fail to investigate thoroughly when concerns were raised. I accepted reassurances from trusted executives that issues had been resolved. That's my culpability, and I take full responsibility for it. And now you're trying to save your company." "I'm trying to save what's worth saving," she corrected. "Westridge employs thousands of ethical scientists and researchers. We produce medications that genuinely help millions of patients. That legacy shouldn't be destroyed by the criminal actions of a few corrupt individuals." Patricia slid another document across the table. "This is the action plan we're implementing. Independent review of all current research data, restructuring of our clinical trial oversight, Creation of an ethics office with direct reporting to the board, not to management. And this, she pointed to a section titled Gregory Walsh Memorial, Fellowship. A funded position for scientists focused on research integrity and ethical pharmaceutical development. We'd like you to have input on how it's structured and awarded. I studied the document, uncertain how to feel. Part of me wanted Westridge to burn to the ground for what had happened to my father. Another part recognized the complexity Patricia described. Thousands of innocent employees, millions of patients dependent on legitimate medications. Why does this matter to you? I asked finally. What I think? What I want? Patricia was silent for a long moment. Because your father was right, she said simply. And because I failed him. Failed to listen when concerns were raised. Failed to investigate properly. Failed to create a culture where scientific integrity mattered more than quarterly results. She met my gaze directly. I can't change what happened, but I can ensure it means something. That Gregory Walsh's courage changes how Westridge, how the entire industry, operates. And Richard? What was his exact role in all this? Richard. Madigan was recruited specifically to monitor you after your father's death, Patricia confirmed. Thomas Blackwell identified him as suitable, ambitious, financially motivated, with enough scientific background to understand the issues at stake. The plan was originally just surveillance to ensure you hadn't received any documentation from your father. But it became more elaborate. Patricia nodded grimly. Richard proposed marriage as a more effective monitoring strategy. The company provided financial incentives tied to his ability to maintain close access to you. What none of us anticipated was that Richard would leverage his position to develop side schemes, the fraudulent property transactions, the offshore accounts, his relationship with Vanessa Hargrove, and my father's death. Was that planned too? The evidence suggests Thomas Blackwell coordinated your father's poisoning with Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, who had access to the thallium compound through her laboratory work. Richard was aware of it, after the fact, but wasn't directly involved in the murder itself. The clinical way she described my father's murder made my stomach turn. How can you sit there and talk about this so calmly? Because falling apart doesn't help bring justice, Patricia replied evenly. You've demonstrated remarkable strength throughout this ordeal, Mrs. Madigan. You've transformed from victim to advocate in ways that have forced an entire industry to confront its darkest practices. That kind of clear-eyed determination is exactly what's needed to create meaningful change. Our conversation continued for another hour, covering specific details about the investigations, Westridge's cooperation, and the status of various executives now implicated in the growing scandal. By the time I left, I had a clearer picture of the vast conspiracy that had claimed my father's life and infiltrated mine, but also of the potential for systemic reform emerging from the wreckage. Diana was waiting in a coffee shop across the street. How did it go? She asked as I slid into the booth across from her. Illuminating, I replied, sharing the documents Patricia had provided. She's trying to salvage what she can while sacrificing the executives directly involved in the criminal activity. Classic damage control, Diana observed, reviewing the materials. But these documents are significant. They provide direct evidence linking Thomas to your father's death and confirm Richard's role as a corporate spy. She's also proposing this fellowship in my father's name, I said, pointing to the relevant section. Part of Westridge's rehabilitation strategy, I suppose. Cynical but potentially beneficial, Diana mused. The question is whether you want your father's name associated with Westridge in any capacity. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to burn everything connected to Richard and Westridge to the ground. Another part thinks my father would want his death to mean something, to create change that protects future scientists who speak up about ethical concerns. Diana squeezed my hand gently. You don't have to decide immediately. Let's see how the criminal cases unfold before making any commitments to Westridge's redemption narrative. The following week brought a flurry of developments. The grand jury returned indictments against Thomas Blackwell, Dr. Eleanor Hargrove, and 5 other Westridge and Novatech executives on charges ranging from securities fraud to conspiracy. Richard was indicted in absentia, with additional charges of identity theft, passport fraud, and money laundering. Most significantly, both Thomas and Dr. Hargrove were charged with first-degree murder in connection with my father's death. Vanessa. Hargrove had turned state's evidence, providing detailed testimony about the conspiracy in exchange for reduced charges. According to Agent Velez, she had been cooperating secretly for several days, her testimony filling critical gaps in the prosecution's case. The media coverage was intense and unrelenting. My story, the teacher who uncovered a pharmaceutical fraud conspiracy after discovering her husband's forged mortgage, had captured public attention. Journalists sought interviews, producers pitched book and movie deals, and social media buzzed with commentary about the case. I declined all interviews, focusing instead on preparing for the trials ahead and rebuilding my life piece by piece. With Diana's help, I listed the Oak Ridge Estates house for sale, using my portion of the proceeds to purchase a small cottage near the university where I had once considered pursuing my doctorate. 6 months after discovering the mortgage statement that had unraveled my life, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Thomas Blackwell's trial. His defense had crumbled after Vanessa's testimony and the mountain of documentary evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, the judge addressed Thomas directly. The court finds particularly reprehensible your role in silencing Dr. Gregory Walsh through murder, then placing an agent in his daughter's life to monitor her for years. The calculated cruelty of these acts, combined with the potential harm to countless patients from falsified drug trials, justifies the maximum sentence available. Thomas received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Dr. Eleanor Hargrove's separate trial ended similarly, though her advanced age meant she would likely die in prison even with a shorter sentence. The remaining executives negotiated plea deals of varying severity, depending on their level of involvement. Richard remained a fugitive, though Agent Velez assured me they were closing in on his location. International financial transactions had been traced to a small coastal town in Southeast Asia, where a man matching Richard's description had established a modest residence. "It's just a matter of time," Velez said. "His funds are running low, his options diminishing. Sooner or later, he'll make a mistake." Patricia Wright had resigned as CEO of Westridge, though she avoided criminal charges. The company entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the Justice Department, paying a $2.3 billion fine and agreeing to extensive oversight and compliance reforms. And the Gregory Walsh Memorial Fellowship had indeed been established, though not under Westridge's control. Instead, an independent foundation was created with funding from the penalties assessed against the pharmaceutical companies. I served on the selection committee, helping choose scientists committed to research integrity and ethics. On the anniversary of the day I'd opened the fateful mortgage statement, I returned to Riverside Federal Credit Union. The same loan officer, Diane Lawson, recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Madigan," she said warmly, "it's good to see you." "Emma, please," I corrected her. "I've reverted to my maiden name, Walsh." "Of course," she nodded. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to establish a scholarship fund," I explained, "for high school students interested in scientific ethics and financial literacy, using some of the settlement funds." As we completed the paperwork, Diane hesitated. "May I say something personal?" "Of course." "When you came in that day, questioning the mortgage statement, I've been in banking 20 years, and I've never seen someone transform a discovery of fraud into such meaningful change. You've helped countless people you'll never meet." Her words stayed with me as I left the bank. 1 year ago, I had been Emma Madigan, the trusting wife who delegated financial matters to her husband. Now I was Emma Walsh, carrying my father's name and legacy forward, teaching not just high school financial literacy, but guest lecturing at the university on corporate ethics and whistleblower protections. The investigation had revealed that Richard had never loved me, that our entire marriage had been a monitoring operation that grew to include his personal financial schemes. That knowledge had been devastating, forcing me to reevaluate 15 years of memories through the lens of his deception. Yet from that profound betrayal had come unexpected strength. The mortgage statement that revealed his fraud had become my advantage. The first thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire conspiracy and brought justice for my father. As I drove home to my cottage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine freedom. Freedom from surveillance, from manipulation, from a marriage built on lies. Freedom to define my own path forward. Richard had mortgaged our home for his mistress, never imagining his quiet teacher wife would notice, investigate, or fight back. His underestimation had been his downfall, and my salvation. 18 months after discovering the mortgage statement that had upended my life, I stood at the podium of a university lecture hall, concluding my presentation to a packed audience of law students, future corporate compliance officers, and current FDA regulators. The most dangerous aspect of corporate fraud isn't the financial damage, I told them, my voice steady and assured in a way my former self wouldn't recognize. It's the human cost. In the case of pharmaceutical data manipulation, that cost is measured in patients who receive ineffective treatments, in scientists whose careers are destroyed for speaking truth, and in families torn apart by corporate greed disguised as progress. A sea of attentive faces looked back at me, many taking notes, others nodding in solemn agreement. These presentations had become a regular part of my new life, sharing the lessons learned from my experience to help prevent similar scenarios in the future. When my father discovered efficacy data was being falsified for ZD45, he couldn't have known that his ethical stand would cost him his life. When I opened a mortgage statement revealing my husband's financial fraud, I couldn't have imagined it would uncover a vast pharmaceutical conspiracy and fundamentally change industry practices. But that's the nature of truth. It creates ripples that extend far beyond our initial understanding. After answering thoughtful questions from the audience, I gathered my materials and exited the auditorium. In the corridor, Dean Margaret Chen waited to escort me to her office. "That was powerful, Emma," she said as we walked through the campus. "The students are still talking about your presentation from last semester. Several have changed their career focus to regulatory compliance as a direct result." "That's gratifying to hear," I replied. "If even a few of them carry these lessons into their professional lives, it creates meaningful change." In Dean Chen's office, she gestured to an elegant leather chair as she took her seat behind a polished desk. "I wanted to discuss something with you privately. The university is establishing a Center for Ethics in Pharmaceutical Research, and we'd like you to direct it." The offer took me by surprise. I'm honored, but I'm not a scientist or a legal scholar. "This center needs something more valuable than academic credentials," she replied. "It needs someone who understands firsthand how crucial ethical oversight is, someone who can bridge the gap between scientific research, corporate accountability, and human impact. Your background in education makes you uniquely qualified to develop programs that will resonate with multiple stakeholders." It was a compelling proposition, an opportunity to institutionalize the advocacy work I'd been doing informally since the trials concluded. "I'd need to complete my doctorate," I mused aloud. Dean Chen smiled. "We've anticipated that. The position includes a tailored doctoral track that incorporates your existing master's work and professional experience. You could complete the requirements while developing the center's foundation." As I drove home from campus, the future stretched before me with possibilities I couldn't have imagined when I was Emma Madigan, high school teacher, and devoted wife. The path hadn't been easy, testifying at multiple trials, enduring media scrutiny, rebuilding my identity after 15 years of manipulation. But it had led to a life of purpose that felt authentic in ways my marriage never had. My small cottage welcomed me with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that faced east by my own preference, not because Richard had insisted western exposure would decrease the property value. The furniture was arranged for comfort rather than impression. Bookshelves filled with volumes I'd always wanted to read but had somehow never found time for during my marriage. On my desk sat a photograph of my father, not the formal portrait Richard had selected for our living room, but one I'd discovered in my father's personal effects, showing him laughing in his laboratory, clearly in his element among microscopes and test tubes. Beside it was a framed newspaper headline, "Westridge Novatech Scandal Leads to Historic Regulatory Reforms." My phone rang as I was preparing a simple dinner for myself. Agent Velez's name appeared on the screen. "Emma," he greeted me when I answered. "Do you have a moment to talk?" "Of course. Is there news about Richard?" There was a brief pause. "Yes, he's been located and apprehended." I sat down slowly, a wave of complicated emotions washing over me. "Where?" "Vietnam. He was living under an assumed identity in a coastal village, working remotely as a financial consultant for local businesses. International pressure finally convinced Vietnamese authorities to cooperate with the extradition, despite some jurisdictional challenges." "How did you find him?" "Ironically, through the lake house. We continued monitoring communications to that property even after the initial arrests. 2 months ago, a sophisticated encrypted message arrived from a server in Southeast Asia. Our cyber team traced it to an internet cafe in Da Nang, then worked with local authorities to identify regular patrons. Richard had altered his appearance, lost weight, grown a beard, dyed his hair, but facial recognition software confirmed the match. I absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the image of Richard living anonymously in a Vietnamese village with the meticulous executive I'd been married to, the man who sent his suits to a specialty dry cleaner and insisted on particular brands of toiletries. "When will he be returned to the U.S.?" I asked. "He's already in federal custody, arrived this morning. The initial hearing is scheduled for next week." Agent Velez hesitated before continuing. "Emma, the prosecutor would like you to testify about your marriage and the events leading to your discovery of the fraud. Are you willing to do that?" The prospect of facing Richard across a courtroom, seeing the man who had spent 15 years monitoring me under the guise of marriage, sent a chill through me. Yet there was also a certain symmetry to it, a completion of the circle that had begun with that mortgage statement. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'll testify." After ending the call, I stepped onto my small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Richard had been caught. The last piece of the puzzle would finally fall into place. My phone chimed with a text message from Natalie. "Just heard the news. Are you okay?" "Processing," I replied honestly. "But yes, I'm okay. Want company?" "Tonight, I can bring wine and takeout." I smiled at my cousin's thoughtfulness. "Thanks, but I think I need some solitude to prepare mentally. Lunch tomorrow?" "Absolutely. Proud of you, Emma." Her simple affirmation warmed me. Throughout this ordeal, I'd discovered who my true supporters were. Natalie, Darlene, and my other colleagues from school, even Dr. Sandoval, who had become an unexpected friend and ally. The bonds formed in crisis had proven stronger and more genuine than the 15-year marriage built on deception. The following week, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Richard's arraignment. He appeared dramatically different from the man I'd known, thinner, with streaks of gray in his previously perfect hair, his confident posture diminished by prison attire and handcuffs. When he entered his plea, "not guilty," his voice lacked the smooth assurance that had once characterized his every utterance. His eyes scanned the courtroom and finally found me in the gallery. For a brief moment, our gazes locked. I expected to see hatred, perhaps defiance. Instead, his expression revealed something closer to resignation. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for my reaction. "Ms. Walsh, how do you feel seeing your ex-husband in custody? Will you be testifying against Richard Madigan? Does this bring closure to your ordeal?" Diana, who had accompanied me to the hearing, fielded these questions with practiced ease. "Ms. Walsh is committed to seeing justice served. She will cooperate fully with prosecutors, but has no further comment at this time." As we walked to her car, Diana asked quietly, "How are you really doing?" "It's surreal," I admitted, seeing him like that, diminished, cornered. For 15 years, Richard controlled every aspect of our life together. He decided where we lived, how we socialized, even how I styled my hair. Now he's completely powerless. Are you concerned about the trial? Facing him, testifying about intimate details of your marriage? I considered this question carefully. A year ago, I would have been terrified. Now, it feels like a necessary step toward complete liberation. The final testimony I need to give before that chapter of my life can truly close. The pre-trial phase stretched over several months, with motions and counter-motions as Richard's defense team attempted to limit evidence and testimony. His attorneys proposed a plea agreement that would reduce charges in exchange for information about remaining conspirators still at large, but prosecutors rejected it as insufficient, given the severity of his crimes. Throughout this period, I continued building my new life. I enrolled in the doctoral program at Dean Chen's University, began developing curriculum for the Center for Ethics in Pharmaceutical Research, and even started dating cautiously, a physics professor named Michael who approached relationships with refreshing honesty and respect for boundaries. When Richard's trial finally began, I took a leave of absence from all commitments to focus entirely on the proceedings. The prosecution had prepared me thoroughly for my testimony, but nothing could fully ready me for sitting on the witness stand, swearing to tell the truth about a marriage that had been built entirely on lies. "Ms. Walsh," the prosecutor began, "could you describe for the jury how you met the defendant, Richard Madigan?" I spoke clearly into the microphone. "I met him at a fundraiser for Parkinson's research, 3 months after my father died from what I believed at the time were complications of the disease. Richard approached me, expressed condolences for my loss, and mentioned his uncle had suffered from Parkinson's as well." "Did you later learn whether that was true?" "It was not. Richard has no family members who had Parkinson's. It was a calculated approach based on information about my vulnerability following my father's death." "How did your relationship with the defendant progress?" I described our courtship, Richard's attentiveness, his apparent respect for my grief, his interest in my teaching career. I explained how he had gradually assumed control of our finances, encouraged me to focus on my classroom rather than pursuing administration positions or further education, and subtly isolated me from friends who might have noticed concerning patterns. "When did you first become aware that something was wrong in your marriage?" "When I discovered a mortgage statement showing our loan balance had doubled due to a second mortgage I never signed for. When I investigated further, I learned the funds had been used to purchase a lake house for Richard's mistress, Vanessa Hargrove, with additional money transferred to offshore accounts." The questioning continued for hours, covering every aspect of our relationship and the subsequent discovery of the pharmaceutical fraud conspiracy. Throughout my testimony, I was acutely aware of Richard watching me, his expression unreadable, his attorney occasionally whispering in his ear. During cross-examination, Richard's lawyer attempted to suggest I had been aware of and complicit in his financial dealings. "Mrs. Madigan?" "Ms. Walsh," I corrected firmly. "Ms. Walsh," he amended with a tight smile. "During your 15-year marriage to my client, you maintained joint accounts, filed joint tax returns, and enjoyed the benefits of his substantial income. Is that correct?" "Yes, while believing that income came from legitimate sources. You never questioned the source of funds for luxury vacations, your home in an exclusive neighborhood, the generous allowance deposited to your personal account? I believed my husband was a successful corporate executive. I had no reason to suspect his income derived from fraud, data manipulation, or monitoring me for a pharmaceutical company. The attorney shifted tactics. You testified that you felt controlled in your marriage, yet you maintained your teaching career, had your own friends, and traveled independently to educational conferences. That hardly sounds like someone under coercive control. Richard's control was sophisticated, I replied evenly. He presented the appearance of supporting my independence while subtly undermining it. He encouraged my teaching because it kept me busy with papers to grade and lessons to plan. Too occupied to pursue the doctorate I had once considered. He approved of certain friends who posed no threat to his narrative. And yes, I attended educational conferences, always reporting in daily, always returning to the life he had constructed. Back and forth it went, the defense attorney trying to find inconsistencies in my account, while I maintained the steady clarity that had become my hallmark since uncovering Richard's deception. When my testimony concluded, Richard's attorney requested a brief recess. Upon returning to court, he approached the bench for a sidebar conference with the judge and prosecutor. After several minutes of hushed conversation, the judge addressed the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed that the defendant wishes to change his plea. Mr. Madigan, please rise. Richard stood slowly, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat I'd never witnessed during our marriage. Mr. Madigan, I understand you wish to withdraw your plea of not guilty and enter a plea of guilty to all charges. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Richard replied, his voice barely audible. Has anyone threatened or coerced you to change your plea? No, Your Honor. Are you making this decision freely and voluntarily, understanding the rights you are waiving and the penalties you may face? I am. The courtroom buzzed with surprised whispers. My testimony had apparently been the final blow to Richard's already crumbling defense. Perhaps seeing me speak truth so clearly about the sham of our marriage had made him realize the futility of his denials. At the sentencing hearing 3 weeks later, Richard was permitted to make a statement before receiving his punishment. He turned partially toward me as he spoke. I've had 18 months in hiding and 6 months in custody to reflect on my actions. Nothing I say can undo the damage I've caused. To patients who received ineffective medications, to Dr. Walsh who lost his life for speaking truth, and to Emma, whose trust I systematically exploited for corporate gain and personal profit. He paused, seeming to search for words. I entered Emma's life with calculated intent, following orders from Thomas Blackwell to monitor the daughter of a whistleblower. What I never anticipated was how that assignment would evolve, how maintaining the deception would become increasingly complicated as I witnessed her intelligence, her integrity, her fundamental decency. Richard's voice wavered slightly. The conspiracy grew beyond its original purpose. Greed eclipsed caution. We believed ourselves untouchable, our schemes too sophisticated to unravel. We never imagined that a simple mortgage statement would bring down an operation worth billions of dollars. He faced the judge directly. I accept full responsibility for my actions and the appropriate punishment for my crimes. The judge sentenced Richard to 30 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy, wire fraud, securities fraud, and accessory after the fact to the murder of my father. His cooperation in providing evidence against remaining conspirators resulted in a slightly reduced sentence from the maximum possible, but he would likely spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. As the bailiff led Richard away, he glanced back at me one final time. I met his gaze steadily, neither triumphant nor bitter, simply present as a chapter of my life concluded. Outside the courthouse, beneath a clear autumn sky, reporters again gathered for comment. Ms. Walsh, does Richard Madigan's sentence bring you closure? This time, I chose to respond directly. Justice and closure are different concepts. Justice has been served through the legal system. Closure is a more personal journey, one that involves rebuilding a life authentic to oneself after profound betrayal. What would you say to others who might be in manipulative relationships without recognizing it? I considered carefully. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Ask questions about finances even when it seems easier to delegate that. Responsibility. Remember that true love empowers rather than controls. And know that even after the deepest deception, it's possible to reclaim your life and transform pain into purpose. A month after Richard's sentencing, I stood on the grounds of Meridian Laboratories, now renamed Walsh Pharmaceutical Research Institute, following its acquisition by a healthcare conglomerate committed to ethical research practices. A small gathering had assembled for the dedication of a memorial garden honoring my father and other scientists who had taken stands for research integrity at personal cost. The garden featured a central sculpture, a DNA helix rising from an open book, symbolizing the intersection of scientific truth and ethical documentation. Surrounding pathways were lined with benches and plaques sharing the stories of whistleblowers whose actions had protected public health despite institutional pressure. After the formal ceremony, I lingered in the peaceful space, sitting on a bench bearing my father's name. Dr. Sandoval joined me, her presence comforting in its understanding. "He would be so proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just for bringing his killers to justice, but for the changes you've created in the industry." "I wish he could have seen it," I replied. "The regulatory reforms, the enhanced whistleblower protections, the ethics center at the university." "He does see it, through the patients whose lives will be saved by honest research and medicines that actually work as claimed." We sat in companionable silence, watching falling leaves dance across the pathways. My life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated when I first opened that mortgage statement. The document that revealed my husband's betrayal had ultimately revealed my own strength, resilience, and capacity for meaningful impact. My new home was truly mine. My career was advancing on my own terms. My relationships were genuine, based on mutual respect rather than surveillance and manipulation. Even my name, Emma Walsh, represented the reclaiming of my identity and my father's legacy. As dusk approached, I rose to leave, touching my father's memorial plaque gently. "The advantage Richard never calculated," I murmured to Dr. Sandoval, "was that truth, once unleashed, cannot be contained. It grows, connects, transforms everything it touches." She smiled, understanding perfectly. And sometimes it begins with something as simple as a bank statement. Walking toward the future. I had chosen for myself. I reflected on the journey from betrayal to purpose. Richard had secretly mortgaged our home for his mistress, never imagining his quiet, trusting wife would notice, investigate, or fight back. That underestimation had been his fundamental mistake, and my unexpected advantage. Music swells to a hopeful conclusion. If this story has shown you anything, I hope it's that even the darkest betrayal can become a doorway to unexpected strength. Financial literacy isn't just about numbers, it's about independence. Truth isn't just a concept, it's a force that can transform industries and save lives. And sometimes, when you think your world is ending, you're actually discovering who you truly are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.